Wilfred Hargrave didn't even let her finish stepping down from the coach. He saw the hair first, that deep, burning copper catching the Wyoming morning light like something on fire. And his face changed before she ever set foot on the ground. Eleanor McKenna had traveled 2,000 miles for this man. She had sold her mother's sewing table, said goodbye to a sister she might never see again, and spent 19 days on a stagecoach that smelled of tobacco and unwashed wool. She had done all of it believing that the man waiting in Willow Creek was the kind of man who kept his word. He was not. "That is not the woman I sent for," Wilfred said. He didn't lower his voice. He didn't step aside to speak to her privately. He stood in the middle of Front Street with half the town watching and said it loud enough for the livery boy to hear from across the road. "I specified a woman of sound disposition and plain appearance. No one told me she was—" He stopped. Looked at her hair the way a man looks at something he finds offensive. Cursed. The word landed like a stone dropped in still water. Eleanor felt the ripple move through the crowd before she felt it move through herself. If you've ever stood in front of people who've already decided what you are before you've opened your mouth, if you've ever felt the ground shift under you in a place you were supposed to belong, then you already know what happened inside Eleanor McKenna in that moment. You already know the exact way her chin lifted, even as something in her chest went very, very still. She was 31 years old. She had buried her mother, nursed her father through 2 winters of sickness, and taught herself accounting from a book with a broken spine. She was not cursed. She was tired. There is a difference, though not everyone is wise enough to see it. What would you have done standing there in the dust with $17 in your coat pocket and a crowd of strangers watching to see if you'd cry? That question, what would you do, is exactly why this story matters. If you're watching from wherever you are in the world, take a moment to like this video and drop your city or country in the comments below. These stories travel farther than I expect, and I love knowing how far they've gone. Subscribe if you haven't, because the stories coming next are the kind that stay with you. And now, let's go back to Willow Creek, Wyoming, 1882, to a woman standing in the street with her whole life in a trunk at her feet and not a single soul on her side. Not yet. The stagecoach driver set her trunk down on the boardwalk with a thud that seemed too loud for the silence that had gathered around her. Eleanor hadn't moved. She was still standing where she'd stepped down, one hand loose at her side, the other gripping her traveling bag with the kind of grip that has nothing to do with the bag and everything to do with needing something solid to hold. Wilfred Hargrave was 44 years old and carried himself the way men do when they've never been told no by anyone who mattered. He wore a good coat. His boots were clean. His mustache was trimmed with the precision of a man who spent time in front of mirrors. He had written Eleanor 2 letters, polite, measured letters that described his mercantile business, his house on the east side of town, his desire for a practical partnership with a capable woman. He had not described himself as cruel. Cruel men rarely do. "I don't know what the agency told you," he said, "but I have standards. A woman with that—" He gestured at her hair, a short, dismissive flick of the wrist. "Coloring is considered ill-fortuned in this territory. I'll not have it said that Wilfred Hargrave brought bad luck into his establishment." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Later, she would not be able to say exactly what she was thinking in those seconds. She would remember the sound of boots shifting on the boardwalk as people repositioned themselves. She would remember the smell of the street, horse and dust, and something sweet from the bakery 2 doors down. She would remember thinking that his coat, up close, was not as fine as it looked from a distance. The stitching at the left shoulder was beginning to separate. "You invited me here," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "On the strength of a letter that described my education, my experience with accounts, and my character. You made no mention of hair." "I made an assumption," Wilfred said, "that a woman of sound background would be presentable. I am presentable. You are conspicuous." He said it like a verdict. "I'll pay your return fare to wherever you came from. That's more than generous under the circumstances." The crowd had grown. Eleanor could feel them without looking. The shift of weight, the small movements of people who wanted to see the next thing happen. A woman in a blue dress near the milliner's window had her hand pressed to her mouth. 2 men outside the feed store had stopped talking entirely. A boy of about 12 was standing on a barrel, craning his neck. Eleanor did not look at any of them. She looked at Wilfred Hargrave, and she thought about 19 days on a stagecoach. She thought about her mother's face. She thought about the letter she had written to her sister Margaret, the one that said, "I think this might be the beginning of something good." She had actually written those words. She had believed them. "Keep your fare," she said. "I'll find my own way." It was the bravest thing she had ever said, and she had no idea how she was going to make it true. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes not from being alone, but from being surrounded by people who have already assigned you a role in a story they're telling about you. Eleanor felt it as she turned away from Wilfred and faced the street, her trunk at her back, her options assembled before her like a hand of cards that were almost entirely useless. $17. No room, no employment, no connection in Willow Creek, except the man who had just publicly refused her. She did not cry. This is worth noting, not because crying would have been weakness, it wouldn't have been, but because the effort of not crying was one of the most physically demanding things her body had ever done, and nobody watching would have known it. She pulled her traveling bag higher on her shoulder and began to walk. She didn't know where she was walking to. She was walking because standing still felt like surrender, and surrender was not something she was prepared to offer. Wilfred Hargrave, or the watching street, or the superstition that had apparently followed her hair across 2,000 miles. She had made it perhaps 20 feet when she heard footsteps behind her. Not tentative steps, not the hesitant approach of someone who wasn't sure they should be doing what they were doing. Deliberate steps, the steps of someone who had made a decision. "Ma'am." She turned. The man standing behind her was not what she would have expected, though she couldn't have said afterward what she had expected. He was broad-shouldered in the way that comes from actual work rather than fashion. His hands were the largest she had ever seen on a person, scarred across the knuckles, permanently darkened at the creases with forged soot that no amount of washing was ever going to fully remove. He had dark hair going gray at the temples and a jaw that needed a razor's attention. He was somewhere between 35 and 45, and his face had the look of someone who had spent time outdoors in difficult weather and hadn't particularly minded. He bent down, picked up the handle of her trunk, and straightened again as though it weighed nothing. "The Granger Hotel's got rooms," he said. "Mrs. Granger doesn't hold with superstition, and she keeps a clean house. I'll carry this if you don't mind the company." Eleanor stared at him. "I don't know you." "No," he agreed. "Name's Daniel Ryder. I run the blacksmith shop on Mill Street." He glanced back over his shoulder at the crowd that was still watching, at Wilfred Hargrave still standing in the street with his clean boots and his bad stitching. Then he looked back at Eleanor. "What he said about your hair, that was ignorance talking, ignorance dressed up as principle, which is the worst kind." Something shifted in Eleanor's chest. Not the awful stillness from before, but something different, something cautious and complicated. "That was a bold thing to say in front of half the town," she said. "Half the town can stand to hear it." She looked at him for another moment. She was not naive. She had lived enough years to know that a man who steps in at the right moment is not automatically a good man. He might be the kind of man who steps in because he wants something, because rescue is a transaction and not a gift. She had learned that particular lesson before. But there was nothing in his face that looked like transaction. He was simply standing there with her trunk in his hand, waiting to see what she decided. "All right, Mr. Ryder," she said. "Thank you." The Granger Hotel was a narrow two-story building squeezed between a dry goods store and a surveyor's office, and Mrs. Granger was a compact woman of about 60, with white hair pinned severely and eyes that assessed Eleanor in approximately 4 seconds and appeared to find the assessment satisfactory. $2 a week, she said, breakfast included. I don't allow drinking in the rooms or visitors after 8 in the evening. The well's in the back and the privy's clean." "I'll take it," Eleanor said. Daniel set her trunk at the foot of the stairs and turned down the coin Eleanor offered for his trouble. "I didn't do it for payment," he said, in a tone that made the offer feel not insulting but simply unnecessary. He picked up his hat from the side table where he'd laid it and moved toward the door, and then he stopped. "I heard you tell Hargrave you'd find your own way," he said, without turning around. "I don't know what your situation is, but if you're looking for work, I could use someone with ledger sense. My accounts are a disaster, and I've been meaning to fix that for 3 years." He walked out. Eleanor stood in the lobby of the Granger Hotel and stared at the door for a long moment after it swung closed. Mrs. Granger was watching her with the particular interest of someone who does not intend to say what they're thinking. "Is he honest?" Eleanor asked. "Daniel Ryder?" The older woman considered this. "He's the most honest man in Willow Creek. Whether that's a high bar is a separate question." Eleanor lay awake that night on a mattress that was better than the stagecoach had been and worse than what she'd left behind, and she did the arithmetic of her situation with the same precision she'd always brought to numbers. $17. $2 a week for the room, breakfast included, which was something. She had skills. She knew accounts. She knew correspondence. She knew how to find errors in a column of figures that other people had given up on. She had not come 2,000 miles to give up in week 1. She thought about Wilfred Hargrave's face when he'd seen her. That flicker of expression, not surprise exactly, but something more immediate than surprise. Disgust. She had seen that expression on people before, usually on people who came from places where red hair was considered unlucky, which was not everywhere and not most places, but was apparently Wilfred Hargrave's place, wherever that was in his small and decided mind. She thought about what Daniel Ryder had said. Ignorance dressed up as principle. She turned the phrase over in her mind the way you turn a coin to look at both sides. She did not know yet if he was someone she could trust, but she knew she needed work, and she knew she had nothing to lose by finding out. She arrived at the blacksmith shop on Mill Street at 7:30 the next morning, because if you're going to make a decision, it is better to make it before you've had too long to think about it. The shop was exactly as chaotic as he had described. The forge was well maintained, but she could see that even without knowing much about forges. But the small back office that served as whatever passed for an administrative center was a landscape of catastrophe. Receipts on 3 different surfaces, a ledger that appeared to have been used as a general notebook, with measurements and sketches interspersed with what might have been income figures if you were generous about the definition of organized. An ink bottle without its stopper sitting perilously close to the edge of a workbench. Daniel was already at the forge when she arrived, working the bellows with the steady rhythm of someone who has been doing this since before his hands were fully grown. He looked up when she came through the door. "You came," he said. He sounded mildly surprised, which she found mildly offensive. "I said I was looking for work. I don't say things I don't mean." She looked at the back office again. "How do you know what you've earned? How do you know who owes you?" "Roughly," he said. "By memory, mostly." "How much have you lost that way?" He thought about it. "Probably a fair amount." "More than fair, I'd guess." She set her bag down on the one clear corner of the workbench. "I'll need to understand your pricing structure, and I'll need those receipts organized before I can do anything useful with them. What are you paying?" He named a figure. It was modest, but not insulting. "One condition," Eleanor said. "I am an employee. I am not charity. If my work doesn't justify the wage within the first month, I'll tell you so myself and save you the conversation." Something moved across his face. She couldn't quite read it. "All right," he said. "That's fair." She took off her coat, found a relatively clean surface, and began. The receipts alone took 3 days. Not because she was slow. She was not slow. But because they represented years of business conducted by a man who kept everything and organized nothing. She found invoices for iron stock going back to 1878. She found 4 separate debts from customers who had apparently never been followed up with, totaling more than she made in a month at her last position. She found evidence that Daniel had been systematically undercharging for custom work, detailed, skilled work, because he had never sat down and calculated what his time was actually worth. She presented her findings on the 4th day, laid out in a new ledger she had purchased with her own money from the dry goods store, every column tight and clear. Daniel sat across from her at the workbench and read through it slowly. He was not a fast reader, she had noticed, not because he was unintelligent, but because he read the way he did everything, deliberately, like a man who doesn't want to have to go back and do it twice. He set the ledger down. "You found all this in 4 days," he said. "The numbers were there. They just needed someone to put them in order." He looked at the ledger again, then at her. "The Whitmore debt. Tom Whitmore. He'll say he never got the work." He signed a receipt. "I found it in the pile from 1880. It has his mark on it." "He won't like being asked to pay." "He already owes it," Eleanor said. "Whether he likes being asked is a different problem." A silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable, the way silences between strangers often are, but something more like two people assessing each other from a comfortable distance. "You're good at this," Daniel said. "I know." She closed the ledger. "You were right that your accounts were a disaster, but the underlying business is sound. You're doing good work at bad prices. That's fixable." He nodded slowly. Then he said something she hadn't expected. "I'm sorry you got the welcome you did when you arrived. That wasn't Willow Creek at its best." Eleanor looked at him. The morning light was coming in from the side window, and his face in that light was less guarded than it usually was. He meant it. That was the thing. He actually meant it. "It wasn't the worst welcome I've ever had," she said, which was technically true. "I'm here, aren't I?" "You are," he said. "I'm glad you are." She went back to work. She didn't let him see that the words had landed, or how they had landed, or what she did with them after they did. She was a practical woman. She knew the difference between a kind employer and something more complicated, and she was not in the habit of confusing the two before she had reason to. But she noted it. The way you note something important you're not ready to do anything with yet. Wilfred Hargrave noticed her within the week. She had not been attempting to be invisible. There was no point, not with her coloring. But she had not been seeking attention either. She went to the shop, she did her work, she ate her meals at the hotel, and read in the evenings, and tried to learn the town without putting herself in the way of the story it had already decided to tell about her. Willow Creek was not a large place. It had Front Street with its mercantile, its 2 saloons, its hotel, its church, and its various small establishments. It had the side streets spreading out from there, the residential blocks, the mill, the livery, the smithy. Everyone knew what everyone else was doing, and everyone knew that the red-haired woman Wilfred Hargrave had rejected was now working in Daniel Ryder's blacksmith shop, and had, in the first week, apparently recovered money Ryder had been owed for 2 years. That last part circulated quickly. Eleanor had not spread it. She suspected Mrs. Granger had mentioned it to someone at breakfast, which was how information moved in a town this size. Wilfred appeared at the shop on a Thursday morning while Daniel was making a delivery and Eleanor was alone. He came in without knocking, which told her something about how he moved through the world. "Miss McKenna!" He looked around the office with the expression of a man who has decided before entering that he will not be impressed. "I see you've made yourself comfortable." Eleanor continued writing the figures she was writing before she looked up. "Mr. Hargrave, I want to be clear," he said, "that I bear you no ill will." "That's generous," she said, which was not the same as meaning it. "I acted quickly on the basis of local custom. You must understand that in a territory like this, certain beliefs hold more weight than they might elsewhere." She set down her pen, looked at him directly. "You stood in the middle of the street and called me cursed in front of everyone within earshot. That's not custom, that's a choice." He had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. Only slightly. "Be that as it may, you're working for Ryder now, and I want to ensure that you understand your position here." "My position." "Ryder is a small operator. He's done well enough, but he doesn't have the kind of standing in this community that—" Wilfred paused, assembling something. "There are stories about Ryder, old stories, the kind of stories that tend to follow a man no matter where he goes." Eleanor felt something go careful in her attention. She kept her face still. "I'm not sure what you mean," she said. She was not sure she wanted to know, and equally sure she needed to. Wilfred looked satisfied in the way that people look when they believe they have just said something that will do work for them. "Just be careful, Miss McKenna. A woman in your position can't afford to attach herself to the wrong kind of reputation." He picked up his hat. "Good day?" He walked out. Eleanor sat for a long time afterward, looking at the page in front of her without seeing it. Stories that follow a man. She knew what that phrase was shaped like. She knew the silhouette of it. What she didn't know was the substance. What specific thing Wilfred Hargrave believed he knew about Daniel Ryder, and whether he knew it accurately, and whether it mattered. She thought about Daniel showing up to carry her trunk when he didn't have to. She thought about 3 days ago when she'd found an error in the pricing schedule that cost him money, and she'd corrected it in his favor without asking, and he'd said, "You didn't have to do that." She'd said, "You're paying me to do accurate work. Inaccuracy in your favor is still inaccuracy." He'd looked at her for a moment and then actually laughed, in a way that seemed to surprise him. She thought about all of that. She thought about the fact that trust is a thing you either decide to extend or you don't, and that she had never been served well by extending it slowly on the strength of other people's cautions. When Daniel came back that afternoon, she told him about the visit. She watched him as she relayed it. His face did not do what she expected. He did not look angry or defensive. He looked tired. The particular tiredness of someone encountering a thing they have encountered before. "What did he tell you?" Daniel asked. "He didn't tell me anything specific. He implied there were stories." A silence. He was quiet for long enough that she began to think he was deciding whether to say anything at all. "There are stories," he said finally. It's not simple." He picked up a length of iron stock and put it down again without looking at it, which was the action of a man who needed something to do with his hands while he said something difficult. "It's not something I'd planned to discuss." "You don't have to discuss it with me," Eleanor said carefully. "But if it becomes something that affects this business, I'd rather know about it before it affects this business." He looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes. Assessment, decision, something. "Not today," he said, "but not never either." She nodded and went back to work. She did not press. Some things had to be offered rather than extracted, and she had lived long enough to know the difference. But she held what he'd said, "not never," and she thought that it was, in its careful way, a kind of promise. On Saturday, the town had its weekly gathering at the general store, a loose, informal thing where people came to collect mail and exchange news and stay long enough to justify the walk. Eleanor went because she needed thread and because hiding in her room was not something she intended to make a habit of. She heard the whispers before she got through the door. Not all of them. Pieces. Fragments. Hargrave's woman, red-haired one, working at the smithy, if you can believe it. My grandmother always said. She kept walking. She collected her mail, one letter from Margaret, which she put in her pocket to read later when she was alone. And she found her thread, and she was at the counter waiting to pay when she heard the voice behind her. "Some nerve," the woman was saying, not to Eleanor but loudly enough that she intended to be heard. "Coming into a town where you're not wanted and settling in like you belong." Eleanor paid for her thread. She turned around. The woman was perhaps 50, with a face that had settled into lines of permanent disapproval, and she was not looking at Eleanor but looking past her in the way that people do when they are performing a reaction for an audience rather than having one for themselves. Eleanor looked at her for a moment. "I'm sorry," Eleanor said. "Were you speaking to me?" The woman looked at her. "I was speaking generally." "Then perhaps speak generally somewhere else," Eleanor said. "I'm trying to conduct my business." She walked out before the woman could respond. She made it half a block before her hands started shaking, not from fear, she identified, with some precision, but from the specific effort of staying calm in the face of something that makes you want to be anything but. She had been doing that for nearly 2 weeks now. The shaking was, she thought, reasonable. She read Margaret's letter standing outside the hotel because she needed to read it right then and she was not going to wait. Margaret wrote that she missed her, that the children asked about Aunt Eleanor, that she hoped Wyoming was treating her well, and that the gentleman seemed kind. Eleanor folded the letter and put it back in her pocket. She thought about what she would write back. Not a lie. She was not going to lie to her sister, but not the whole truth yet either, because the whole truth at this moment would worry Margaret in ways that Eleanor could not afford to be worried about right now. She would say Wyoming was more complicated than she'd expected. She would say she had found work. She would say she was managing, because she was managing, even if managing looked different from the outside than it felt from the inside. She went upstairs and wrote the letter. Then she took out the new ledger she'd bought for the shop and sat at the small table by the window and worked out a pricing schedule for Daniel's custom work based on the actual hours involved in each type of job. Because there was something steady about numbers when everything else was still shifting, and steadiness was what she needed. She worked until the light gave out, and then she lit the lamp and worked a little longer, and by the time she was done, the shaking in her hands had stopped. 10 days into the job, she found the discrepancy in the Alderman account. Theodore Alderman ran the largest ranch outside of town, cattle, mostly, with some horses, and he was one of Daniel's oldest customers. The account went back 7 years. Eleanor had been working through it methodically, and what she found, when she laid the figures out side by side, was a pattern she recognized from the ledger work she'd done back east. Alderman was shorting the invoices, not dramatically, never enough in any single transaction to trigger obvious suspicion, but consistently, over 7 years, he had paid approximately 80 cents on every dollar he owed, and the cumulative shortfall was more than $200. Eleanor sat with this for a full day before she said anything to Daniel. She wasn't certain it was intentional. She had seen honest accounting errors before, but the pattern was too consistent, the margin too regular, for accident to be the comfortable explanation. She laid it out for Daniel on a Tuesday evening when the shop was quiet. He read through her documentation twice. She watched him and said nothing. "He's been coming here since before I opened this place," Daniel said. He was not angry. She noticed that. He looked more tired than angry. "He gave me my first contract when I first set up in Willow Creek. He told people I was reliable." "I know," Eleanor said. "That may be true, and this may also be true." $200. 214 by my count, though I'd want to verify against receipts before you confront him. "I don't know that I want to confront him." She looked at him steadily. "I understand that. He's an old customer and you have a complicated history with him, and it's easier to let it go. I understand all of that. I'm just telling you what the numbers say." She paused. "What you do with it is your decision." He was quiet for a long time. The forge had gone cold for the evening, and the shop was just the two of them and the sound of the street outside. "You're not what Hargrave deserved," Daniel said. He said it quietly, almost to himself, like something he hadn't quite planned to say out loud. Eleanor looked at him. Her throat did something complicated. "No," she said, after a moment. "I wasn't." Outside, Willow Creek was settling into evening. Lamps in the windows, the last voices of the day's commerce fading off. Eleanor gathered her papers and her coat, and she walked back to the hotel in the cooling dark. And she thought about a lot of things. About the Alderman account. About what Daniel had just said. About Wilfred Hargrave and his clean boots, and his bad stitching, and the story he was apparently still, somewhere in that small, decisive mind of his, continuing to tell about her. She thought about the $17 she'd arrived with, and the fact that she now had 19 because she had been careful with the modest wage Daniel paid and had not spent unnecessarily. $2 a head. It was not much, but it was movement. And movement, in Eleanor McKenna's experience, was not nothing. She went upstairs, washed her face, and went to sleep with the lamp still burning, because she had learned that there are nights when darkness helps and nights when it doesn't, and she was smart enough by now to know which kind of night this was. The Alderman problem did not resolve itself the way uncomfortable things sometimes do when left alone long enough. Eleanor had laid the figures in front of Daniel and told him the decision was his, and she had meant that. She was not in the habit of making other people's choices for them. But 3 days passed, and then 4, and Theodore Alderman came into the shop on a Friday morning to discuss a new order of fence hardware, and Daniel shook the man's hand and talked about iron pricing and delivery timing and said nothing at all about $214 spread across 7 years of deliberate underpayment. Eleanor sat at her desk in the back office and kept her eyes on her ledger and said nothing either. After Alderman left, Daniel stood in the doorway between the shop floor and the office for a moment. He didn't say anything. Eleanor could feel him there the way you feel weather, not seeing it yet, but knowing it's coming. "I know," he said finally. "I didn't say anything." "You didn't have to." He came in and sat down on the stool across from her. It was too small for him, and he always looked slightly uncomfortable on it, which she had come to think of as one of his more human qualities. "He's got 3 sons, and they all ride for him. If I bring that to him and he decides to make it a problem, it becomes a problem." "And if you don't bring it to him," Eleanor said, "he continues to underpay you for the next 7 years." "Yes." "So the question is which problem you can afford." He looked at her. "You make it sound simple." "It's not simple, but it is a choice, and right now you're pretending it isn't, and that's the part I take issue with." She closed the ledger. "I'm not telling you to confront him today. I'm telling you that the documentation exists and it's solid, and when you're ready to use it, it'll be there." He nodded slowly. Something in his face was doing work she couldn't quite read. Not quite reluctance, not quite resolution, somewhere between the two. "You grew up doing this?" he asked. "Accounts?" The question surprised her. Not the subject of it, but the timing. The way he'd shifted direction. The way people do when a conversation has gotten close to something true, and they need a moment before they go closer. My father's business, she said. Hardware, actually. Smaller than this, in Philadelphia. He taught me the ledgers when I was 12 because he said I had a head for numbers, and my brother didn't. My brother went to work for a bank, and I went to work in a back room where no one had to explain why a woman was doing sums. She paused. When my father died, the business went to my brother and I went looking for another position. That's how I came to be answering an advertisement in a Wyoming newspaper. Daniel was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry about your father. He was a good man. He had high standards for the work and low tolerance for excuses, and he thought women were as capable as men, but that was his private opinion because it was not a popular public opinion, and he had to eat. She picked up her pen. He would have liked your forge. He always respected craftsmanship. Would he have liked me? It was a direct question, more direct than she'd expected from him, and she felt it land in the specific way that direct questions land when you're not braced for them. Probably, she said after a moment. He liked people who did what they said they'd do. She went back to the ledger before he could say anything else, and he went back to the forge, and neither of them acknowledged what had just passed between them, which was perhaps the wisest approach, given that she had been in Willow Creek for less than 3 weeks and was still sleeping on a hotel mattress with $19 to her name. The town made its opinions known gradually, the way towns do, not in a single proclamation, but in accumulations, small things. The way Mrs. Alderman greeted Eleanor at the dry goods store, politely, with that particular variety of politeness that is more about maintaining one's own dignity than acknowledging someone else's. The way Reverend Thatcher, whom Eleanor had never spoken to, had apparently remarked at a Sunday gathering that the wages of hasty judgment were often borne by the innocent. The way the boy from the livery stable, whose name was Percy, and who was 12 and very interested in everything, started appearing at the smithy window during Eleanor's working hours and asking her questions about numbers. How do you know what things are worth? Percy asked one afternoon, his elbows on the window ledge, his chin on his hands. You figure out what they cost to make, Eleanor said, and then you add what your time is worth. How do you know what your time is worth? That's the question, isn't it? She kept writing. It's worth what someone will pay, which depends on how much they need what you can do. If nobody else can do what you do, your time is worth more. If anybody can do it, it's worth less. Percy chewed on this. Can anybody else do what you do? Eleanor considered. In Willow Creek? Probably not. So your time is worth a lot. Apparently not enough yet, she said, which made him laugh. A quick, surprised laugh that made her smile despite herself. She did not know it then, but Percy told his mother about that exchange, and his mother told her neighbor, and the neighbor mentioned it to someone at the milliner's, and it moved through Willow Creek in that efficient underground way that information moves in small towns, and what came back, the version that circulated, was that the red-haired woman at the smithy had told a child that hard work made a person valuable, which was not precisely what she'd said, but was not entirely wrong either. Reputations are built from smaller materials than people expect. Wilfred Hargrave understood this better than most, which was why he began his campaign against Eleanor and Daniel in small increments. It started with a comment at the bank, something about the difficulty of trusting a business whose bookkeeper arrived without references, without connection, without the kind of verifiable history that established people required before extending credit. He said it casually, as though it had occurred to him spontaneously, which meant he had been thinking about it for some time. The banker, a cautious man named Greaves, who believed in caution as a personal virtue, made a note of it and said nothing, but noting things was its own kind of action. Then there was the meeting of the Merchants' Association, where Wilfred mentioned, again casually, again in that way that careful men deploy as a weapon, that he had heard Daniel Ryder was extending credit to customers without proper documentation, which could create difficulties down the line for anyone who had business dealings with the smithy. He had heard no such thing. Eleanor documented everything, down to the last quarter. But a rumor doesn't need to be true to need refuting, and refuting a rumor takes more energy than spreading one. And Wilfred Hargrave had been running this calculation for a long time. Eleanor learned about it the same way she learned about most things in Willow Creek, through Mrs. Granger, who heard everything and selected carefully what she chose to pass along. He's been talking, Mrs. Granger said, over breakfast one Tuesday, setting down the coffee pot with a precision that communicated disapproval. About you and Ryder both. About the reliability of the business. What exactly has he said? Nothing he'd have to answer for, if you take my meaning. Nothing you could point at and call a lie. Just questions. The kind of questions that leave marks. Eleanor buttered her bread and thought about this. He's frightened, she said, more to herself than to Mrs. Granger. Hargrave? Of what? Of being wrong. She took a bite of bread. He made a decision in public that turned out to be wrong, and now the wrong decision is walking around town doing good work, and every day that continues is evidence of how wrong he was. Men like him don't tolerate that kind of evidence. Mrs. Granger sat down across from her, which was unusual. She rarely sat with her boarders during breakfast. What are you going to do about it? Right now? Eat my breakfast. Eleanor picked up her coffee, and then go to work and do it very well. Daniel had his own intelligence network, which was less organized than Eleanor's, but longer established. He knew people in this town the way you know the geography of a place you've lived in for years, not always thinking about it, but knowing where everything was. He knew which men were reliable and which weren't. He knew who would stand up when it mattered and who would find reasons to be elsewhere. He told Eleanor about the Merchants Association comment on a Wednesday, which meant he'd heard it on Tuesday, which meant he had spent a day deciding whether to tell her. You waited, she said. I wanted to think about how to handle it first. And? And I don't have a clean answer. He was at the workbench, doing something to a set of hinges that required more attention than it was getting. Hargrave has standing here. He's been in Willow Creek longer than I have, and he's got money, and people owe him for things, and that's the kind of standing you don't argue against directly without it looking like a fight, and I don't want this to look like a fight. It already looks like a fight, Eleanor said. The difference is you're not fighting back. There's a difference between fighting back and fighting smart. She considered him. He was right, she thought. He was not wrong. But there was something in his caution that ran deeper than strategy, and she had been noticing it for 2 weeks now, the way you notice a door that's always slightly closed, never fully open, never fully shut. The stories Hargrave mentioned, she said carefully, when he came here last week. Daniel's hands went still on the hinges. I'm not asking you to tell me, Eleanor said. I told you that, and I meant it. But whatever it is, Hargrave seems to know about it, and if he decides to use it the way he's been using everything else, it might be better if I already know. A long silence. Outside the shop, a wagon went by, and the sound of it, wheels and horses, and the driver shouting something at someone on the other side of the street, filled the gap while Daniel was deciding what to do with it. Kansas, he said finally. He said it like a place can be an explanation. 7 years ago, there was a man, a landowner named Calder. He was the kind of man who... He stopped, started differently. He and I had a dispute about land, about water rights, about things that are complicated to explain and that I'm not entirely proud of how I handled at the start. And then Calder turned up dead, and I was the most recent person to have argued with him, and in a territory in 1875 that was enough for certain people to decide they knew the answer. Eleanor set down her pen. They accused you, she said. They accused me. I didn't wait around to see how a trial would go. I know how that looks. It looks like a man who didn't trust the justice available to him. He glanced at her. That's a generous reading. It's the most accurate reading of why innocent men run, Eleanor said. What happened to the case? It went nowhere. No trial, no verdict. Just a cloud. The kind that follows. He picked up the hinges again, turned them over in his hands. Hargrave found out about it somehow. I don't know how. But he's been holding it for a while, I think, waiting for a reason to use it. The thing Eleanor felt in that moment was not what she'd expected to feel. She had expected wariness. The careful, sensible wariness of a woman in an uncertain position, learning that her employer had a complicated history. What she felt instead was something closer to anger. Not at Daniel, at the machinery of it, at the way a man like Hargrave held information like a blade, not to use honestly, but to hold over someone's head indefinitely, to determine the shape of what was possible for them. All right, she said. All right? I said I wasn't asking you to tell me. You told me anyway. That's all right. She picked her pen back up. I'm going to finish the Alderman documentation this week. If Hargrave decides to bring up Kansas, we'll be in a much better position if everyone already knows that this business is in good order and that its accounts are clean. Daniel stared at her. That's your response. What response did you expect? I don't know, not that. I'm your bookkeeper, Eleanor said. The best thing I can do for both of us is make this business so visibly sound that Wilfred Hargrave's rumors look like the sour grapes they are. She wrote a figure in the ledger. Now let me work. He went back to his hinges, but she noticed in the next hour that he worked with a slightly different quality of concentration. Not distracted, as he sometimes was, but settled in a way he hadn't been before. As though something that had been holding tension in him had found a way to release it. She said nothing about it. She filed it away in the same careful place she put everything she was not ready to do anything with yet. The alderman confrontation came sooner than Eleanor expected, and from a direction she hadn't anticipated. It was not Daniel who brought the documentation to Theodore Alderman. It was Alderman who came to the smithy on a Friday afternoon shortly before closing, which Eleanor had come to recognize as the time when people came to have conversations they'd been postponing all week. He was a big man, Alderman, not tall, but wide, with the solid, settled look of a man who had been giving orders for long enough that he no longer remembered what it felt like to receive them. He came into the office without waiting, nodded briefly at Eleanor, and looked past her at Daniel with the expression of someone who has been managing a slight discomfort and has decided to address it. "Heard you've got someone going through the old accounts," Alderman said. "I do," Daniel said. He had come in from the forge when he heard the door, and he was still holding a pair of tongs, which Eleanor thought was probably not deliberate, but happened to be useful. Eleanor's put the records in order. Should have done it years ago. Alderman's eyes moved to Eleanor and back. "Found anything interesting?" There was a pause. Eleanor watched Daniel. This was the moment. He could step sideways from it, could say something careful and non-committal that preserved the surface while leaving the problem underneath. He could do that, and she wouldn't say a word about it. Daniel set down the tongs. "There's a discrepancy in your account, Ted, going back to 1876. The silence that followed was of the particular quality that happens when something that's been unsaid finally gets said. Alderman's expression didn't collapse. It tightened. "I've paid every invoice. Not the full amount, not consistently." Daniel nodded at Eleanor. "She's got the receipts." Eleanor opened the folder she had prepared for exactly this possibility and laid it on the workbench, organized by year, each shortfall documented with the corresponding receipt and the payment actually received. She had kept her handwriting clean and her columns straight, and it looked exactly like what it was: a patient, thorough accounting of money not paid. Alderman looked at it. He didn't pick it up. "That could be errors," he said. "Accounting errors. Could be anyone's mistake." "Could be," Eleanor said. "But the pattern's very consistent, Mr. Alderman. The same margin across 7 years. Errors tend not to work that way." He looked at her directly for the first time since he'd come in. It was not a friendly look. It was the look of a man deciding how angry he can afford to be. "You've been here a month," he said, "coming in and going through people's business, making accusations." "I made an observation," Eleanor said. "The documentation makes the accusation." The vein in Alderman's neck was doing something visible. "Ryder, you're going to take her word over mine? Over 7 years of business between us?" "I'm going to take the receipts," Daniel said, "which are what they are regardless of whose word we're talking about." Alderman picked up his hat from the table where he'd set it. His movements were controlled, the movements of a man who was angry and did not intend to show more of it than he could afford. "I'll need to review my own records." "You're welcome to," Eleanor said. "If you find something that changes the figures, I'd like to see it. If you don't, we'd appreciate settlement within 30 days. He left without responding to that. The door swung shut behind him with more force than necessary. In the silence that followed, Daniel let out a long breath. "He'll tell people," Daniel said. "He'll tell people who will then ask themselves why he didn't dispute the receipts," Eleanor said. "There's a difference between a man going out and saying Ryder accused me and a man going out and saying Ryder's bookkeeper found an error. One is a fight, the other is a business matter." "You've thought about this." "I've thought about a lot of things." She straightened the folder and put it back in its drawer. "He may pay. He may not. But either way, he knows that this business keeps accurate records and will follow up on them. And that's worth something regardless of how the Alderman account resolves." Daniel looked at her for a moment with an expression she was getting slightly better at reading. Still not fully readable, but less opaque than it had been 3 weeks ago. "My father," he said, "used to say the pen was mightier than the sword. I always thought that was the kind of thing people say when they're trying to make clerks feel better about being clerks. And now? Now I'm watching you fight Alderman with a folder of receipts and win. I haven't won yet, she said. No, but you're winning. Two things happened in the following week that changed the shape of the situation. The first was that Theodore Alderman paid the debt. Not the full 214, he paid 200 even, with a note that said in settlement of all outstanding matters, which was Alderman's way of calling it a rounding error, without calling it anything at all. Daniel brought the money to Eleanor and she entered it in the ledger, and neither of them said much about what it meant, but it meant a lot. It meant a man with 3 sons and a large ranch and 20 years of standing in Willow Creek had looked at Eleanor's folder of receipts and decided that paying was easier than fighting. The second thing was that Wilfred Hargrave went to Greaves at the bank and requested that Daniel's line of credit be reviewed on the basis of, and this was how Greaves relayed it to Daniel with some discomfort, reputational concerns regarding the management of the business. Daniel told Eleanor this on a Tuesday morning, standing in the doorway of the office in the same way he always stood in doorways, one shoulder against the frame, as though not fully committing to entering. He told it flatly, without obvious emotion, in the manner of a man who has learned to deliver bad news to himself before delivering it to anyone else. Eleanor's first feeling was fury. Her second feeling was that fury was not useful right now, and she should put it somewhere out of the way until it was. "What does Greaves actually think?" she asked. "Greaves is a cautious man. He'll want documentation." "Then we give him documentation." She pulled out the ledger. "I have 3 months of accounts here. Clean, organized, with every transaction documented and every debt marked as current or pending. We take this to Greaves. Not because we owe him an explanation, we don't, but because showing him what we have is faster than letting Hargrave's version fill the space." "We," Daniel said. She looked up. "What?" "You said we." She had said that. She hadn't decided to say it. It had come out as though it were already true, which was either evidence of how far she'd settled into this work or evidence of something she wasn't ready to examine too closely. "The business," she said. "Right," he said, in a way that did not entirely mean right. They went to the bank on Wednesday morning, both of them, which was unusual enough that several people on Front Street noted it. Eleanor wore her good gray dress, which was her most respectable garment, and the one she kept clean specifically for situations that required looking like someone who made good decisions. Daniel wore his Sunday coat and had made a genuine effort with his hair, which was touching in a way she filed away in the same careful place as everything else. Greaves was a small man with wire spectacles and the specific nervousness of someone who worked very hard to make people believe he was not nervous. He received them in his office and looked at Eleanor with the slight discomfort of a man who wasn't accustomed to women bringing ledgers to his desk. Eleanor set the ledger in front of him and opened it to the current accounts page. "We understand there have been questions about the management of Ryder's business," she said. "I've brought 3 months of accounts. Every transaction, every debt, every payment received and outstanding. The business is solvent. The records are clean. If you have specific questions, I'd rather address them directly than leave them unaddressed." Greaves looked at the ledger. He looked at it the way an accountant looks at something, not reading it so much as assessing its quality. His expression shifted. "This is very organized," he said. "Yes," Eleanor said. "Your previous records—" He glanced at Daniel. "We're not," Daniel said. "That's why I hired Miss McKenna." Greaves turned pages. Eleanor watched him and said nothing. The silence in the bank office was of a completely different quality from the silence in the smithy. Thicker, more official, more consequential. "The Alderman account," Greaves said, pausing. "This shows a settlement received this week." "Correct," Eleanor said. He turned another page. His expression was doing something careful. He closed the ledger and looked at Eleanor over his spectacles. "Miss McKenna, you arrived in Willow Creek last month." "I did." "Under, He paused, selecting something. "Difficult circumstances." "Yes." "And you've done all of this in a month." It was not quite a question. The records were here. They needed organizing. Greaves set his spectacles on the desk in the way of a man who has made a decision. "I don't see a basis for reviewing the credit line," he said. "The accounts appear to be in good order." He looked at Daniel. "Better order than I'd expect, frankly." She's better than I expected, Daniel said. He glanced at Eleanor when he said it, and something in the glance was not quite professional, and she looked away. They walked out of the bank into the midday sun of Front Street, and for a moment neither of them said anything. The street was busy, the hour before noon always was, and people moved around them without acknowledging them, which was either good or bad depending on the day. That's one thing, Daniel said finally. It's not the last thing, Eleanor agreed. He'll find another. He always does. He stood with his hat in his hands, turning it the way he turned objects when he was thinking. Why do you think he's so determined? You're not a threat to his business. You work for a blacksmith. Eleanor considered this honestly. Because every morning I walk out of the hotel and go to work, and I don't disappear, she said. And every day that happens, the story he told about me, about what I am and what I deserve, gets a little harder to maintain. He needs me to fail. If I don't fail, he was wrong, and being publicly wrong is the one thing men like Wilfred Hargrave cannot tolerate. Daniel put his hat on. My father would have liked you, he said, and walked back toward the smithy. Eleanor stood on Front Street for a moment after he'd gone. In the noon light, people moving around her, the town of Willow Creek continuing its business in every direction. She thought, my father would have liked you too. She did not say it to anyone. She walked back to work. The town meeting was not something she'd planned to attend. The Willow Creek Town Council held meetings on the first Thursday of every month, and Eleanor had been aware of them the way she was aware of most things in town, as background information filed for possible future use. She had not particularly intended to go because she had not yet been in Willow Creek long enough to have opinions about municipal affairs that she felt entitled to speak publicly. What changed her mind was hearing, through Mrs. Granger and through Percy, and through the general circulatory system of the town, that Wilfred Hargrave intended to raise the question of business licensing at the meeting. Specifically, new requirements for business licenses that would include a character review process requiring letters of reference from established community members. The target of this was not subtle. Eleanor sat in her room the evening before the meeting and thought about it. She wrote 3 columns on a piece of paper, the way she'd been taught to think about problems. What she knew, what she didn't know, what she could actually do. She wrote for a long time. Then she folded the paper and put it in her coat pocket and went to bed. She told Daniel she was going the next morning. He looked at her. Eleanor, I'm going as a resident of this town, she said. I pay rent here. I conduct business here. I'm entitled to attend a public meeting. I know you're entitled. I'm asking if you're sure. Are you coming? A pause. Yes. Then we're both sure. The meeting was held in the back room of the council building, which was also used for storage and always smelled slightly of sawdust and old paper. It was more crowded than usual. The licensing question had drawn people who didn't often come to these meetings, and Eleanor felt the awareness of the room shift when she walked in. The small collective recalibration of people noting her presence and deciding what to do with it. She found a seat near the back. Daniel sat beside her. Wilfred Hargrave was near the front, which was where he positioned himself at most public gatherings. He saw them come in and his expression went briefly, precisely still, in the way of someone who had expected this and had planned for it. The council ran through its other business first. Water rights on the East Branch, a road improvement, a dispute over a property boundary. Eleanor listened to all of it and made mental notes, because you never knew when information was useful and it cost nothing to pay attention. When Wilfred rose to introduce the licensing question, he did it with the polished ease of a man who had been rehearsing. He talked about standards. He talked about the importance of community trust. He talked about the need for verifiable character in those operating businesses that served the public, all of it phrased so carefully that it was impossible to attach his name to any specific attack while the attack was fully operational. Then he sat down, and there was a murmur in the room, and one of the council members asked if anyone else wished to speak. Eleanor stood up. She heard the shift in the room. She did not look at Wilfred. She looked at the council, at the 5 men sitting at the front table with their varying expressions of wariness and attention. I'm Eleanor McKenna, she said. I've been in Willow Creek for 6 weeks. I manage the accounts at Ryder's Blacksmith on Mill Street. She paused. She had prepared what she wanted to say, but she also knew that prepared words sometimes failed in the moment, and you needed to be ready to find better ones. I came to this town to build a life here. The circumstances of my arrival weren't what I'd planned, But I stayed, and I've worked, and I'd like to think the work has been useful. I've organized 7 years of records. I've recovered money owed to a local business. I've kept accurate books and paid my rent on time and followed the law." She stopped. The room was very quiet. "The proposal before you would require letters of reference from established community members," she said. "I want to ask the council directly. What is the purpose of that requirement, and who does it serve? Because what I've learned in my 6 weeks here is that established doesn't always mean right, and that a woman who arrives without history isn't automatically without worth." She looked at the room, not at Wilfred. "That's all I wanted to say." She sat down. For a moment there was silence. Then, from somewhere in the middle of the room, someone started clapping. Not dramatically, just a steady, simple clapping, the kind that means yes. A few more people joined it. Not everyone, not even most people, but enough. Wilfred Hargrave's face was doing something she couldn't fully see from the back of the room, and she was glad she couldn't. The council tabled the licensing proposal for further discussion, which meant it was not dead, but it was not moving forward, and that was enough for tonight. Outside afterward, in the cooling air, Daniel stood beside her, and they didn't speak for a moment. "You knew it wasn't going to pass," he said. "I knew it might not. I wasn't certain." "Then why stand up?" She thought about how to answer that honestly. "Because the next time I walked into that room," she said, "or any room in this town, I wanted there to be a record of what I'd said. Not what he'd said about me, what I'd said about myself." She pulled her coat closer. "There's a difference." Daniel nodded. He was looking at the street, at the lamplight spreading in uneven patches across the dust. "I talked to Greaves again today," he said. "He mentioned that he's thinking of expanding the bank's services to businesses in town. Partnerships of a kind." He paused. "He asked if you might be available to consult on the financial assessments." Eleanor turned to look at him. "He asked for me," she said. "He asked for the person who brought him that ledger. Said he'd never seen records that organized from a shop that size." Daniel looked at her sideways. "I told him I'd ask." She stood in the lamplight of Front Street in Willow Creek, Wyoming, and let that sit for a moment. 6 weeks ago, she had stepped off a stagecoach with $17 and a broken plan. Tonight, a banker had asked for her by name. "Tell him yes," she said. Daniel nodded. They walked back toward the hotel in the dark, the town settling around them, and Eleanor thought about what came next with something closer to anticipation than she'd felt since she boarded the stagecoach in Philadelphia, which was not peace exactly, and not certainty, but was the feeling of moving forward on ground that was beginning, slowly, to hold. The consulting arrangement with Greaves at the bank turned out to be less formal than the word consulting implied, and more demanding than Eleanor had anticipated, which was saying something, because she had anticipated it being demanding. Greaves wanted her 2 mornings a week, reviewing loan applications from local businesses, not deciding on them, he was careful to clarify, because deciding was the bank's function, and he was not prepared to hand that to an outside party, but assessing the financial documentation, identifying weaknesses in the records, flagging discrepancies. He paid a modest fee per assessment, and Eleanor took it because modest fees add up, and because the work itself was exactly the kind of work she did well and found genuinely interesting in the way that only people who actually like numbers can find numbers interesting. She told Daniel about the arrangement on a Thursday morning before she went to the bank for the first time. He was at the forge, and he listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she had come to appreciate about him. He did not fill silences with his own voice when someone else was using them. 2 mornings a week, he said when she finished. Wednesday and Friday. I'll be at the shop by noon both days. It won't affect your accounts. I'm not worried about my accounts. He set down what he was working on. I'm wondering how Hargrave's going to take it when he finds out Greaves hired you. Poorly, Eleanor said. That's an understatement. Probably. She picked up her bag. But Greaves made the decision, and Greaves is not a man who reverses decisions once he's made them. Hargrave can have opinions about it. She moved toward the door. I'll be back by noon. She was back by 11 because the first 2 assessments took her 40 minutes combined and revealed a level of bookkeeping in both establishments that made her mildly despairing about how businesses operated in this territory. She told Greaves, with as much diplomacy as she could manage, that both loan applications had documentation problems that needed to be corrected before the bank could responsibly assess them. Greaves looked at her over his spectacles. I had already approved one of those in my head. Then it's good I looked at it before you approved it on paper, Eleanor said. He made a sound that was not quite agreement but was not disagreement either, and Eleanor went back to the smithy and got to work on the quarterly accounts, which were in much better shape than they had been 8 weeks ago, and which she was beginning to take a quiet, private satisfaction in. It was Percy who told her about the man. Not immediately. He appeared at the window on a Tuesday with the expression of someone carrying information they're not entirely sure how to deliver, which on a 12-year-old's face is particularly readable. "There's a man at the hotel," Percy said. "He came in on the noon stage. He's asking about Mr. Ryder." Eleanor kept her eyes on the ledger. "What kind of asking?" "The kind where he goes quiet when people come nearby." She looked up. Percy was watching her with the serious expression he got when he thought something was important, which she had learned to take seriously. "What does he look like?" "Tall, got a badge." Percy paused. "Federal, not county. Different shape." Eleanor set down her pen. A federal marshal in Willow Creek asking about Daniel Ryder in the quiet voice of someone who didn't want to be overheard was not something she could file away for later. It was something she needed to understand right now, because if Wilfred Hargrave had found a way to accelerate whatever he had been holding in reserve about Kansas, then the comfortable forward motion of the past 2 months was about to meet something that had been moving toward it from the opposite direction for 7 years. She thanked Percy and sent him back to his errands and sat for 10 minutes thinking carefully before she did anything else. Daniel was out making a delivery to the Hendricks farm. He wouldn't be back until late afternoon. She considered going to the hotel herself and decided against it. A woman walking in to ask questions about a federal marshal asking questions was not subtle, and subtlety was currently an asset she did not want to waste. Instead, she went back to her ledger. She worked with careful, deliberate focus for the next 2 hours because there was nothing she could do about what was coming, and there was something she could do about the quarterly accounts. And doing what you can do in the face of what you can't is not resignation. It's the only kind of sense that holds up under pressure. Daniel came back at 4:30 with wagon dust on his coat and the settled look of a man who has spent an afternoon doing physical work and found it clarifying. Eleanor told him about the marshal before he had his coat off. He stood very still. "You're sure it's federal?" "Percy's sure. He's been watching that hotel door since he was 8 years old. He knows the difference." Daniel sat down on the stool, the too small stool he always looked slightly ridiculous on, and put his hands on his knees and looked at the floor. She watched him go somewhere in his head, somewhere she couldn't follow, and she gave him the time to do it. "His name is Calder," Daniel said, finally. Not the marshal. She understood that. The dead man. "Warren Calder. He owned most of the good water access in the county we were in. He charged whatever he wanted, and he had the sheriff in his pocket, and he drove out 3 families I knew personally." He paused. "I was vocal about it. Too vocal, probably. I said things publicly I should have said differently." "What happened to him?" "Someone shot him. In his own barn, with his own rifle." He looked up. "I was 2 miles away having an argument with his foreman about a water access fee he doubled without notice. The foreman could confirm I was there. He didn't when it mattered, because the foreman worked for Calder and Calder's widow was still paying his wages." Eleanor absorbed this. "The foreman. Is he still alive?" "I don't know. I left Kansas in '75 and I haven't been back, and I haven't kept correspondence with anyone there." "What about anyone else who might have seen you that afternoon?" He thought. "There was a boy at the water station, 14, maybe 15. He saw me argue with the foreman." He rubbed his face. 7 years ago. I don't know where he is now." Eleanor stood up and went to the drawer where she kept the business documentation. Not because she needed anything in it, but because she needed to do something with her hands while she thought. "What's the charge?" she asked. "Do you know if there's an actual warrant or if this is a—" "I don't know. I don't know what a federal marshal here means. It could be that someone's reopened the investigation. It could be something else entirely." He paused. "It could mean they found evidence that it wasn't me." She looked at him. "Or evidence they think confirms it was." Yes. The honesty of that, his willingness to say the worst possibility out loud, was something she noted. There were men who would have leaned into the hopeful version and asked her to lean with them. He didn't. He put both possibilities on the table and let them sit there, which was uncomfortable and correct. "Don't go looking for him," Eleanor said. "Let him come to you. If he has a warrant, he'll serve it, and then we deal with what comes next. If he doesn't, there's no reason to hand him anything he hasn't already found. And if he does have a warrant, then we need someone who knows the territorial law. Is there an attorney in Willow Creek? Thaddeus Croft. He's handled land disputes mostly. I don't know if he's done criminal work. Find out tomorrow, Eleanor said, quietly. Daniel nodded. I was looking at her with an expression she had seen on him a few times now. Not quite gratitude, not quite something else, but somewhere between the two, in the territory of a man who has spent a long time managing difficult things alone and is finding the experience of not managing them alone, both a relief and something harder to name. Eleanor. Don't, she said. Not unkindly. Let's just handle the next thing. The marshal's name was Aldous Webb, and he found Daniel the next morning. Eleanor was not there for the first conversation. She heard about it later from Daniel, who told it with the flat economy of someone who has been working hard to keep their account of events as accurate as possible without letting what they felt about the events distort the telling. Webb was not what Daniel had expected. He was past 50, gray-haired, with the worn-down quality of a man who had been doing difficult work for a long time without particularly expecting it to get easier. He came to the smithy mid-morning, introduced himself without theater, showed his identification, and said he was investigating the 1875 death of Warren Calder of Pratt County, Kansas. You weren't easy to find, Webb said, which was neither accusation nor compliment, just fact. I wasn't trying to be found, Daniel said. No. Webb looked around the shop in the unhurried way of a man collecting information without appearing to collect it. You've built something here. I have. Shame to have it disrupted. He said this without evident sympathy, which made it more honest than most sympathy. I'm going to need to talk to you at some length, Mr. Ryder. Not today. Tomorrow, if you can manage it. I want to understand your account of the afternoon of October the 14th, 1875. Am I under arrest? Webb considered him. Not today. Which meant maybe later. Which meant it depended on what the conversation tomorrow revealed, or what Webb already had, or both. Daniel told Eleanor all of this over the remains of the lunch she'd brought to the shop, which neither of them had eaten much of. She listened to the whole account before she said anything. Not today, she said. That's what he said. That means he's still deciding. He has something, some piece of evidence or testimony that made the investigation worth reopening. But he doesn't have enough to move on it without hearing your version. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. That's actually better than it sounds. It sounds like a man who hasn't arrested me yet. It sounds like a man who's being careful, which means he's not certain. She set the cup down. Did you go see Croft? This morning, before Webb came. He's handled 2 criminal matters. One was a property dispute that went to assault charges. One was a theft. He's not a defense attorney in the traditional sense. Daniel paused. But he's smart. And he's not Hargrave's man, which is the relevant criterion. Bring him tomorrow, to the conversation with Webb. Webb didn't say I could bring anyone. Webb didn't say you couldn't, Eleanor said. And you're not obligated to speak to a federal marshal without counsel. That's not evasion. That's the law. Daniel looked at her for a moment. How do you know that? My father had a business dispute that went to litigation when I was 19. I sat in on every meeting with the attorney because my father believed I should understand how these things worked. She paused. He was right. Well, Croft came, and Webb accepted his presence with the equanimity of a man who had expected it. The 3 of them, Webb, Daniel, and Croft, met in the back room of Croft's office on a Thursday morning, and Eleanor was not in the room, which she had accepted because Croft had advised it, and Croft's advice was sound. She sat in the front office on a chair that was slightly broken on the left side and read through the territorial land regulations she'd borrowed from the council building, because if there was going to be a legal proceeding of any kind, she intended to understand the landscape in which it operated. She heard voices, but not words. She tracked time by the clock on Croft's wall, which needed winding and ran slightly slow. They were in there for an hour and 40 minutes. When the door opened, Webb came out first. He looked at Eleanor with the assessing gaze of a man who had been told she existed and was now calibrating the information against the reality. He nodded at her. Not the nod of a man who has decided anything, but the nod of a man who has noticed something he intends to keep noticing. He left without speaking to her. Daniel came out behind him. His face was the face of someone who has been in a difficult conversation for a long time and has not fully emerged from it yet. Croft followed and looked at Eleanor with an expression she couldn't read. "There's a witness," Daniel said. He sat down in the chair Webb had just vacated, which creaked under the weight of a man larger than Webb. "Someone came forward 6 months ago, in Kansas. A man named Elias Booth, who used to work on the neighboring property." He stopped. "He says he saw me go into Calder's barn that afternoon." The room was very quiet. "Did he?" Eleanor asked. "No." Daniel said it without hesitation, which she believed. "I was at the water station. I was arguing with the foreman. I never went near Calder's property that day." "Then Booth is lying," Eleanor said. "Or misremembering," Croft offered carefully. 7 years is a long time. "Or lying," Eleanor repeated. "Why would someone come forward after 7 years to name a witness account that didn't come up at the time?" Both men looked at her. Neither answered immediately, which meant neither had an answer ready, which meant it was a question worth pressing. "Who benefits from reopening this?" she said. "The Calder family?" "Warren Calder's widow remarried," Daniel said. "She's in Missouri, far as I know. His sons scattered." He rubbed the back of his neck. "There's no obvious material benefit to his family from a conviction now, 7 years later." "Then someone else benefits," Eleanor said, "or someone is afraid of what a continued investigation might find." She looked at Croft. "Webb's reopening this investigation. That means something prompted it besides Booth's witness account. Someone reopened it from the federal level. Why would the federal government care about a county murder in Kansas from 7 years ago?" Croft sat forward. He was a lean, precise man in his late 40s with a methodical quality to his thinking that Eleanor had already come to respect. Calder had a land patent dispute with the territorial government over a water access corridor that crossed federal land. It was unresolved at his death. He paused. "If someone is trying to settle that land dispute now, and there's been talk of railroad access routes through that corridor, a murder conviction against the man who was most publicly opposed to Calder would close certain questions conveniently." Eleanor looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at Eleanor. "Railroad," he said. "Railroad," she confirmed. It was not a complete picture. It was a corner of a picture. Enough to know that the thing looking back at them was larger than one federal marshal asking questions in a Wyoming smithy. But a corner was more than they'd had an hour ago, and Eleanor had learned in her particular variety of difficult years that you work with what you have until you have more. "I need to find the boy from the water station," Daniel said. "The one who saw me arguing with the foreman." "He'd be 21, 22 now," Eleanor said. "He could be anywhere." "He could be," she agreed, "but he existed. He was a real person who saw a real thing. That's a starting point." She turned to Croft. "Is there a way to request documentation from the Pratt County records? The water station would have had a log. If Daniel was there arguing about a fee, there might be a record of the dispute, a complaint filed, a notice of the adjusted rate." Croft's expression sharpened. "That's possible. County records aren't always well kept, but the water access disputes in that period were contentious enough that some of them generated paper." "Then we request the paper," Eleanor said. "Webb is conducting an investigation. We conduct one too." The town found out within 48 hours, because in a town the size of Willow Creek, nothing remained private for 48 hours. And a federal marshal staying at the hotel and meeting with the blacksmith was too large a thing to stay quiet. Eleanor heard the change in the way people greeted her. It was subtle, not hostility mostly, but a reinstated wariness, the particular caution of people who had been deciding to trust something and were now pausing mid-decision to wait and see. She understood it. She didn't like it, but she understood it. What she had not anticipated was Wilfred Hargrave's restraint. He said nothing publicly in the days following Webb's arrival, which surprised her. She had expected him to move quickly, to use the investigation as the confirmation of the story he'd been telling about Daniel since she arrived. Instead, he was quiet, and his quietness had the quality of someone waiting for a particular moment rather than someone who had nothing to say. Mrs. Granger, who understood Wilfred Hargrave the way that people understand fixtures they've lived with for years, offered a view on this. "He wants it to be worse before he speaks," she said, with the bluntness Eleanor had come to appreciate. "A rumor's worth more when there's more smoke behind it." "Then we need to move before the smoke builds," Eleanor said. "How?" Eleanor thought about this for several days, and during those days she kept working. The bank assessments on Wednesday and Friday, the Smithy accounts, the ongoing effort of building something solid in a place that was currently trying to decide whether to let her. She worked because working was what she knew how to do when she was frightened, and she was frightened, though she had not said so to anyone, including herself, in those exact words. Daniel was frightened too. She could see it in the way he moved through the shop, more deliberate than usual, with the careful economy of a man trying to take up less space, as though making himself smaller could make the situation smaller. He slept badly. She knew this because he was always at the forge earlier than made sense, the way people who can't sleep find work to do before the sun comes up. One evening, about a week after Webb's arrival, Eleanor stayed late at the shop going through the correspondence related to Croft's record request from Pratt County. She was still there when the lamps on Front Street came on, and Daniel came into the office after closing up the forge and stood in the doorway with soot on his hands and an expression that had given up on being unreadable for the night. "You don't have to stay," he said. "I know that. I mean, you could go. From Willow Creek. This is my problem, and you've been here 2 months and you've built something real here. And if this goes badly, if Webb—" He stopped. "I don't want what I dragged behind me from Kansas to touch what you're building." Eleanor set down the correspondence. She looked at him across the office in the lamp-lit dark, and she thought about $17 and a stagecoach and the specific quality of his voice when he'd picked up her trunk in the street and said ignorance dressed up as principal. "You didn't drag me anywhere," she said. "I walked here on my own." "Eleanor, I'm going to say this once, and then I'd like us to stop having this conversation," she said. "I am not leaving. Not because I'm naive about the risk. I understand the risk, and it concerns me considerably, but because leaving is not what I do when things get difficult, and I'm not going to start now simply because the difficult thing is larger than usual." She picked up the correspondence again. "Now, Croft thinks the county might have a record of the rate dispute. If they do, it puts you at the water station at the right time. That's what we need to focus on." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. "The boy," he said. His name was Samuel. He was running the collection bucket at the south end of the station. He had a gap between his front teeth, and he laughed when the foreman started yelling because he'd seen it before. He paused. "I don't know his family name." "Samuel, South Station, Pratt County, 1875. Eleanor wrote it down. "Croft has contacts in Kansas from his land work. It's not nothing. It's a first name and a gap in his teeth. 7 years ago, nobody could have found me from my first name and a physical description, and yet here's Webb having managed it," Eleanor said. "People can be found." He looked at her with that expression again, the one she didn't have a clean name for, the one that lived in the territory between gratitude and something that required more time and more stability than either of them currently had to give it proper attention. "Thank you," he said. "Just that." "Don't thank me yet," she said. "Thank me when Croft finds the record." Webb stayed in Willow Creek for 10 days, and in those 10 days Eleanor spoke to him exactly once, by design. She had considered whether to approach him and had decided, finally, that approaching him was better than letting him form his entire picture of the situation from Daniel's account alone and whatever Wilfred Hargrave might find occasion to offer. She went to the hotel on a Tuesday morning, at the time she knew from Mrs. Granger that Webb took his breakfast, and she sat across from him at the table by the window before he had the opportunity to object. Webb looked at her with the weary patience of a man who had seen several varieties of interference in his career and was waiting to see which variety this was. "I'm not here to obstruct anything," Eleanor said. "I'm here because I've been working alongside Daniel Ryder for 2 months, and I know his business and his character, and I thought it was worth your time to hear from someone who isn't his attorney and isn't his enemy." Webb cut a piece of his breakfast without looking up. "I generally find that the people who volunteer character assessments to federal officers have a specific reason for doing so." "I do have a specific reason," Eleanor said. "He's a good man who's been living under the threat of something that isn't true for 7 years. And if someone's trying to use a federal investigation to clear the way for a railroad land deal, I'd like to think a marshal with Webb's reputation would want to know that's happening." Webb's fork paused. He looked at her. "How do you know about the land deal?" "Thaddeus Croft made the connection," she said. "Calder's unresolved land patent, the federal water corridor. The railroad access route that several interested parties have been lobbying about for the past 18 months. She set a folded piece of paper on the table, a copy of the summary Croft had written out at her request. That's not Daniel Ryder's argument. That's documentation of what was happening in that corridor before and after Calder's death. Webb didn't pick up the paper immediately. He looked at it the way he'd looked at her, assessing, deliberate, the unhurried assessment of a man who had not survived a long career by making fast judgments. Elias Booth, Eleanor said, the witness who came forward. What's his connection to the current land discussions? Webb picked up the paper. He read it, and his face did not change, which was in itself a kind of answer. The face of a man finding something he'd half expected or half suspected, not the face of a man encountering a surprise. Mr. Ryder is fortunate in his associates, Webb said. He is, Eleanor agreed. So is Willow Creek. She stood, nodded politely, and walked out. She told no one about the conversation, not Daniel, not Croft, not Mrs. Granger. Some moves were better left undisclosed until their consequences were clear, and she had learned over the course of a hard and instructive life that the value of certain actions was often diminished by announcing them. The letter from Pratt County arrived on a Friday, 12 days after Croft had sent the request. Eleanor was at the bank when Croft sent word, and she came to his office at noon to read it herself, because she trusted Croft's summary, but she trusted the original document more. She had been reading documents long enough to know that summaries sometimes smoothed over the exact phrase that mattered. The letter contained a copy of an entry from the Pratt County Water Authority dispute log, dated October 14, 1875. The entry recorded a formal complaint filed by one Daniel Ryder of Haskell County against the Calder Water Access Company regarding a unilateral rate increase on the South Branch distribution point. The entry noted that the complaint had been received at the South Station office and that station manager Harold Fenn had been present during the filing. Harold Fenn. Not the foreman Daniel had argued with, a different man, a station manager who had been there. And below Fenn's notation, in different handwriting, a witness line. The collecting assistant had signed his name, Samuel Pruitt. Eleanor read the name twice. She set the letter down. She looked at Croft. Samuel Pruitt, she said. It's a real name, Croft said. He was trying to be measured about it and not entirely succeeding. That's a real name we can work with. If he's still alive and findable. He is, Eleanor said. She did not know this, but she said it the way you say things that have to be true before they can become true. Find him. She took the letter, the copy, not the original, and walked back to the smithy. She went in without knocking, which she never did, because she had been not knocking for 2 months, and the formality of knocking at this point would have been strange. Daniel was at the forge. He looked up when she came in, read her face, and put down what he was holding. She held up the letter. He crossed the shop floor and took it from her and read it standing there with the forge heat at his back, and she watched him read it the way she watched everything that mattered, carefully, noting the details. His hands weren't steady by the end of it. She noticed that. He noticed that she noticed and didn't try to correct it. Samuel Pruitt, he said. We have a name now. He looked up from the letter. His eyes were doing something she had not seen them do before, something that had been held back for a long time by the practical necessity of holding it back, and that the letter had apparently unlocked in the particular way that real evidence unlocks things that hope alone can't quite reach. If Webb finds him first, Daniel started. Webb is a careful man doing a careful investigation, Eleanor said. He may already be looking in this direction. The paper I gave him at breakfast pointed toward Booth's credibility. If Webb is as good as his reputation, he'll pull the same thread we've pulled. She paused. We don't need to beat him to Samuel Pruitt. We need Samuel Pruitt to be found. Daniel nodded. He folded the letter with the care of a man handling something fragile, which it was, in its way. Fragile and solid at the same time, the way the best evidence is. 7 years, he said. I know. I thought about it every day. I built this place and I tried to make something that was worth what I'd left behind. And there was always this part of it that felt like I was building on sand because if they ever found the right person to tell the wrong story, all of it would just... He stopped. It won't, Eleanor said. You can't know that. No, she agreed. But the letter exists. Pruitt's name exists. The land deal connection exists. None of those things existed 3 weeks ago. She looked at him directly. The sand is getting firmer. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. Not quite, but the shape of one, which was closer than he'd managed in the 2 weeks since Webb had arrived. Outside the shop, Willow Creek moved through its afternoon. Wagons and voices and the ordinary commerce of a town that was still, for the moment, making up its... Eleanor was aware of it in the way she was always aware of it now, not with dread, but with the specific alertness of someone who understood that towns are made of people, and people can be moved, and moving them took patience and work, and the willingness to keep showing up even when showing up was hard. She went back to the desk. She had accounts to finish, and Croft needed a letter drafted to a contact in Pratt County regarding the whereabouts of one Samuel Pruitt, and the afternoon was already more than half gone. She picked up her pen and began. The letter to Croft's contact in Pratt County went out on a Friday and came back 3 weeks later, which was faster than Eleanor had expected and slower than she could comfortably tolerate. In those 3 weeks, Webb remained in Willow Creek. He did not serve a warrant. He did not make additional formal requests of Daniel. He moved through the town with the patient, observational quality of a man who is waiting for something to resolve itself, staying at the Granger Hotel and taking his meals at the same table by the window, and occasionally stopping to speak with people on Front Street in the unhurried way of someone conducting an investigation that he had not yet decided was finished. Mrs. Granger reported that he read in the evenings and turned his lamp out early and was, as a boarder, entirely unproblematic. Eleanor found his continued presence more unsettling than an arrest warrant would have been. A warrant was a defined thing. You could respond to a warrant. Webb sitting at his window table and watching the town was something else. Something that had no edges, that couldn't be answered directly, that simply hung over the daily work of building and maintaining like weather that refused to break. Daniel managed it better than she expected, which she later revised. He managed the surface of it well, because he had been managing the surface of difficult things for a long time. Underneath was different. She saw it in the tightness around his eyes by the end of a long day, and in the fact that he was now at the forge before 6 every morning, and in the way he occasionally stopped mid-motion and stood very still for a moment, as though listening for something. She did not comment on any of this. She brought extra coffee in the mornings and let the work be the work. The town watched all of it. That was the nature of Willow Creek. It watched everything and formed opinions, and those opinions moved through the social channels of the place with remarkable efficiency. Eleanor had become skilled at reading the gradations. Who greeted her warmly, who greeted her carefully, who managed a nod that contained the full complexity of a person who had not yet decided, and who looked elsewhere when she passed. What she noticed in those 3 weeks was that the gradations were slowly shifting, not dramatically. This was not a story about a town that reversed itself overnight and recognized its errors in a clean, collective moment. Real towns didn't work that way, and she had never expected them to. But the shift was there. Percy's mother had started nodding at her from across the street. The woman at the dry goods counter, who had been precise and correct in her transactions, had last week asked Eleanor's opinion about a bolt of fabric, not because she needed Eleanor's opinion, but because asking was a form of acknowledgement that she was there and worth asking. Small things. The kind that add up over time into something you couldn't point to on any single day, but that made a genuine difference in how a place felt. Greaves at the bank told her, at their Wednesday session, that 2 more local businesses had inquired about her availability for account reviews. He said it with the satisfied air of a man who considered himself responsible for her professional reputation in Willow Creek, which irritated her mildly, but she had learned to accept credit that arrived in imperfect packaging. "Word gets around," Greaves said. "It does," Eleanor agreed and turned back to the loan assessment she was reviewing, which had problems on page 3 that she needed to address before she could say anything useful about it. Wilfred Hargrave made his move on a Wednesday, 17 days after Webb's arrival, and he did it in the way that Eleanor had come to understand was characteristic of him. Not directly, not with his name visibly attached to it, but through the machinery of social and civic pressure that he had spent years assembling and knew how to operate. He called a gathering, not a town council meeting, he didn't have that authority, but the Merchants Association met at his invitation, which amounted to the same thing in practical terms, because the Merchants Association represented most of the economic weight of Willow Creek, and a gathering of economic weight in a frontier town was its own variety of authority. Eleanor heard about it from Croft, who had heard about it from Greaves, who had been invited and had the presence of mind to be troubled by what he heard in the room. The substance of what Wilfred said, as Greaves relayed it to Croft and Croft relayed it to Eleanor, was structured carefully. Wilfred had not accused Daniel of murder. He had not needed to. He had instead raised the question of what it meant for a community's reputation to have a business operating at its center that was currently the subject of a federal investigation, and whether the association's members felt comfortable extending professional relationships, credit, partnerships, referrals, to an establishment under that kind of scrutiny. He had spoken about the importance of Willow Creek's standing as the railroad discussions developed. He had spoken about risk. He had not said Daniel Ryder is a murderer. He had said Daniel Ryder is a risk, and that was worse, because it was a sentence that reasonable people could agree with without committing to anything specific. Eleanor sat with this information for the better part of an afternoon. Then she went to see Webb. She found him at his usual table with his usual coffee and sat across from him without asking permission, as she had the first time. "Elias Booth," she said. "Where is he now?" Webb looked at her with the specific expression of a man recalibrating. "That's not something I'm able to discuss with you." "I know that. I'm not asking you to discuss it with me." She folded her hands on the table. "I'm going to tell you something, and you can do whatever you think is appropriate with it." She paused. "There was a gathering of this town's business community last evening. The man who organized it is the same man who came to this hotel shortly after your arrival and asked whether there was anything he could provide that might be useful to your investigation." Webb's expression did not change, but he set down his coffee cup. "I'm not speculating about what he told you or whether you found it credible," Eleanor continued. "What I'm telling you is that Wilfred Hargrave has a direct financial interest in whether Daniel Ryder's reputation in this town survives the next month. He lost a contract to Daniel's shop last spring, iron supply for the new grain storage building. And he lost it because Daniel's work is better and his pricing is fair, and everyone who deals with him knows both of those things." She looked at Webb steadily. "I'm not asking you to close your investigation. I'm asking you to consider the context in which certain information about Daniel Ryder has been offered to you, and who offered it." Webb looked at her for a long moment. "You're a careful woman, Miss McKenna." "I've had to be. Most people in your position would be asking me to clear Ryder's name and leave." "Most people in my position aren't thinking about what comes after," Eleanor said. "If Ryder is cleared because the evidence clears him, that's durable. If he's cleared because someone pressured a federal marshal to move on, that's not durable, and Hargrave will find another way to use Kansas within the year." She stood. "I'd rather wait for the right result than push for a fast one." She left before he could respond because she had said what she came to say, and adding to it would only dilute it. The letter from Pratt County arrived on a Thursday morning, and it contained two things. The first was a confirmation that Harold Fenn, the water station manager listed in the dispute log, had died in 1878. That door was closed. The second was an address. Samuel Pruitt, formerly of Pratt County, Kansas, was currently employed as a land surveyor's assistant in Laramie, Wyoming. The contact had located him through a professional registry. He was 22 years old and had been in Wyoming for 8 months. Laramie was 4 hours by rail from Willow Creek. Eleanor read the letter 3 times. Then she took it to Croft. Croft read it once, set it down, and looked at Eleanor with the expression of a man revising his assessment of several things simultaneously. "We need to talk to him before Webb does," Eleanor said. "We don't know that Webb hasn't already found him." "No. But if Webb had found Pruitt and Pruitt had confirmed Daniel's account, this investigation would likely already be moving differently." She looked at the address on the letter. "Webb is still here, still waiting. That suggests he doesn't yet have what he needs to close it in either direction." Croft drummed his fingers once on his desk. "I should go to Laramie." "We should go to Laramie." He looked at her. "He's more likely to talk if there's a reason to talk," Eleanor said. "A lawyer showing up to ask about a 7-year-old incident looks like legal pressure. Someone who is genuinely affected coming to ask for the truth of what he saw looks different." Croft was quiet for a moment. Then, "Have you told Ryder?" "Not yet. I wanted to see if you thought it was viable first." "It's viable." He picked up the letter. "When?" "Saturday. The morning train." She told Daniel that evening. He was closing up the shop when she came back, banking the forge for the night. moving through the end-of-day routine that she had watched often enough by now to know its stages. She waited until the fire was banked and he'd washed his hands and come into the office before she told him about the letter, and Laramie, and what she and Croft intended to do on Saturday morning. He stood in the middle of the office and looked at her, and didn't say anything for long enough that the silence moved past comfortable and arrived somewhere else. "Samuel Pruitt is in Laramie," he said finally. He said it the way you say something you're still in the process of believing. "Has been for 8 months. That's—" He stopped. Tried again. "That's 4 hours from here, this whole time." "Yes." He sat down. Not on the small stool this time, but on the workbench itself, which meant he needed something sturdier than usual. He put his hands on his knees and looked at the floor, and Eleanor could see him doing the mathematics of it. 8 months, 4 hours, 7 years, and all of it converging in a letter from a county record contact that had arrived this morning like weather nobody had predicted. "What if he doesn't remember?" Daniel said. "He may not remember everything, but the dispute log entry with his name on it already places him at the station on the right day. All we need is for him to confirm what he signed at the time. And if he won't, then we're no worse off than we were yesterday." Eleanor sat down across from him. "But Daniel, he signed that entry in 1875. He was a 14-year-old boy doing his job at a water station, and he wrote down what he saw. That's not the signature of someone hiding something. That's the record of someone being honest when it didn't cost him much." She paused. "People who are honest when it's easy are more likely to be honest when it's harder. That's been my experience." He looked up at her. There was something in his face that had been building for weeks, and that she could now see clearly. Not desperation, but something close to its opposite. The expression of a man who had spent years being careful not to want things too much. Because wanting things too much in his position had seemed like a structural risk. She understood that. She had her own version of it, though the shape was different. "You and Croft," he said. "Saturday morning. We'll be back by evening." "I should come." "You shouldn't." She said it gently but directly. "Pruitt is going to hear from some quarter that a federal marshal is in Willow Creek investigating a man named Ryder. If you show up in Laramie, it looks like intimidation regardless of your intentions. Croft and I look like inquiry." He considered this. He didn't like it, but she could see him finding the logic of it. "I'll stay," he said. "Yes." He looked at her for another moment. "Eleanor, why are you doing this?" It was a genuine question, not rhetorical. She could tell by the directness of his eyes when he asked it, the way he had of looking at the thing he wanted to understand rather than looking around it. She thought about several honest answers. She chose the one that was most honest without being more than either of them was ready for. "Because the truth is in Laramie," she said, "and somebody ought to go get it." Saturday arrived cold and clear, the kind of October morning in Wyoming that announced winter's intentions without quite delivering on them yet. Eleanor and Croft took the 6 o'clock train, which was nearly empty at that hour, and sat across from each other with the particular focused quiet of two people who have a job to do and are both aware that the job matters. Croft had brought the duplicate of the dispute log entry. Eleanor had brought the original letter from the Pratt County contact, and her notebook, and the composure she had been deliberately assembling since Thursday evening, like a woman selecting tools for a specific kind of work. "He may ask why we're coming to him and not working through Webb," Croft said, somewhere past the first hour of travel. "If he asks that, we tell him the truth. Webb is conducting his own investigation. We're conducting ours. Both can be true at the same time." "And if he's already spoken to Webb?" "Then we'll know from how he answers the door." Eleanor looked out the window at the grasslands moving past. "I'm not worried about him having spoken to Webb. I'm slightly worried about whether he'll speak to us at all. He has no obligation to." "People generally do talk when they're asked respectfully about things they witnessed honestly," Croft said. "In my experience." "In mine too." She turned back from the window. "Let's hope he's that kind of person." Samuel Pruitt was living in a boarding house on the east side of Laramie, the kind of address that indicated careful management of a modest wage. He answered the door in his work clothes, a young man with an open face and the beginning of a beard that hadn't yet decided what it wanted to be. And he looked at Eleanor and Croft with the wariness of someone who was not expecting visitors on a Saturday morning. Croft introduced himself and explained briefly and without pressure why they had come. Pruitt looked at Eleanor. then at the document in Croft's hands, then back at Eleanor. "You'd better come in," he said. The room was small and orderly in the way of someone who had grown up without much space and had learned to be organized within it. There were surveying instruments on a shelf and a row of books that had been read enough times to show it. Pruitt sat on the edge of his bed and gestured at the two chairs, and they sat, and Croft put the document on the table between them. Pruitt looked at it for a long time without touching it. "I remember that day," he said. I'd been at the station about 3 months. It was my first real job." He paused. "The man came in around 2 in the afternoon, maybe 2:30. He was angry, but not violent angry. The kind of angry where someone's been treated unfairly and they've decided not to just take it." He looked at Eleanor. "The foreman told him the rate had gone up, and that was Calder's decision, and there was nothing to discuss. The man said he was filing a formal complaint, and he wanted it entered in the log. So Fenn entered it." He touched the edge of the document. "I signed as witness because I was standing right there." "Did you see this man at any other point that day?" Croft asked. "I saw him leave the station, heading south, not toward the Calder property, the opposite direction." Pruitt's voice was even. "When they said Calder was shot that evening, and they were looking at the man who'd been arguing at the water station, He stopped. "I was 14. My mother worked for a family that had dealings with Calder's estate. I didn't know what to do with what I knew." "You didn't come forward," Eleanor said. Not accusingly, just naming it. "No." He was quiet for a moment. "I've thought about that a fair amount since." "What made you leave Kansas?" "Wanted to be somewhere that wasn't connected to all of it." He looked at the document again. "I heard, about a year after I left, that someone said they'd seen Ryder go into Calder's barn. I knew that wasn't right. But I also knew that by then I was in Wyoming, and the person who needed to hear that was either someone who would listen or someone who wouldn't, and I didn't have a way to know which." Croft leaned forward. "Mr. Pruitt, we'd like to take a formal statement from you. I'm an attorney practicing in Willow Creek. The statement would be notarized, documenting what you saw on October 14th, 1875. Specifically that Daniel Ryder was at the South Water Station and departed in the direction away from the Calder property." He paused. "There is a federal marshal currently investigating this matter. Your statement would become part of that investigation." Pruitt was quiet for a long moment. "Does Ryder know I'm here?" he asked. "He knows your name," Eleanor said. "He remembered you. He said you had a gap between your front teeth and that you laughed when the foreman started yelling because you'd seen it before." Something moved across Pruitt's face. Not quite a smile, something older and more complicated than a smile. "He remembered that," Pruitt said. "He's a man who pays attention to people," Eleanor said. Another silence. Pruitt looked at the document, at Croft, at Eleanor. He was doing what honest young men do when they're about to make a decision they should have made years ago and know it. He was gathering himself up to it. "I'll give you the statement," he said. They were back in Willow Creek by 7 in the evening, and Croft went directly from the station to his office to finalize the notarization, and Eleanor went directly to the smithy. Daniel was there. She had known he would be. She had known he'd find it impossible to be anywhere else on a day when he'd sent the two people working on his behalf 4 hours away on a train and had nothing to do but wait. He'd been working the forge, or trying to. The shop had the look of a man who had been present in body but not in mind. He heard her come in and turned from the forge, and she held up the statement before he could say anything. He crossed the floor in 3 steps and took it from her. He read it with the same deliberateness he read everything, not rushing, not skimming, reading every word like a man who has been waiting a long time to read exactly this thing and intends to do it right. When he finished, he held the paper at his side and looked at her, and for a moment he didn't look like the man who had lived under Kansas for 7 years. He looked like what he actually was, which was a man who had been telling the truth all along and had just watched someone else finally write it down. "He remembered," Daniel said. "He remembered everything." He set the statement on the workbench very carefully. Then he sat down on the too small stool, which creaked under him as it always did, and he put his face in his hands and he stayed that way for a moment while Eleanor stood nearby and said nothing at all. She did not look away. Looking away would have been a form of courtesy that he didn't need from her. When he looked up, his eyes were dry, but only just. "We still have to give it to Webb," he said. "Croft is delivering a copy tonight. Webb will have it in the morning. And then And then we see what Webb does with it. She picked up her coat from the hook by the door. He's a careful man. He'll verify it. He'll look at Pruitt's account against what Booth claims. If he's doing his job correctly, he'll look at what a railroad deal through the Calder corridor would mean for anyone who wanted the 1875 investigation to come out a certain way. That takes time. Probably a week, maybe 2. She looked at him. You've waited 7 years, Daniel. You can wait 2 weeks. He made that sound again. Almost a laugh, the shape of one. You say that like it's simple. I say it like it's true, she said. Whether it's simple is a separate matter. The week that followed was the strangest Eleanor had spent in Willow Creek, which was saying something, given that her first week had involved being publicly called cursed and sleeping on a hotel mattress with $17. Webb received the statement. Croft confirmed that the delivery had been made and that Webb had read it in Croft's presence without obvious reaction, which they both agreed was either a good sign or a neutral one, and was in any case not a bad one. Webb sent 2 telegrams that Croft tracked through connections without going into detail about how, one to a federal records office in Topeka and one to an address in Missouri that neither of them could immediately account for. 2 days after the statement was delivered, Elias Booth arrived in Willow Creek. Eleanor learned this from Percy, who had resumed his station as the most efficient information system in the territory, and she told Daniel and Croft within the hour. Booth was a heavy-set man in his 50s, Percy reported, who arrived on the noon stage and went directly to the Granger Hotel and asked for Marshal Webb. Did he find him? Eleanor asked Percy. Webb was out. He left a note and took a room. That Booth had come to Willow Creek voluntarily, without being summoned by Webb as far as they knew, was a development Eleanor turned over in her mind for several hours. Men who came voluntarily to defend their witness accounts were either very confident or very nervous. And confident men generally did not travel 400 miles on short notice. She was in the shop on a Thursday morning when Croft came in with his coat still on and his hat in his hand, which meant he had come directly from somewhere and hadn't stopped. Webb interviewed Booth last evening, Croft said. I was not a man who dramatized, which made his current expression more readable than usual. And? Daniel said from behind Eleanor. And this morning Webb sent a telegram to his office in Denver. Croft set his hat on the workbench. I don't know the content, but the telegrapher, who is a cousin of one of Croft's land clients, and who did not precisely violate his professional obligations but came close, indicated that the message contained the word inconclusive, used twice. Inconclusive, Eleanor said, meaning Booth's account is inconclusive, meaning Webb has the water station record and Pruitt's statement on one side and Booth's account on the other, and they don't reconcile, and he's telling his office he can't move forward on the basis of what he has. Daniel had gone very still. That's not cleared, Eleanor said. She needed to say it before he built too much on it. That's not an exoneration. That's a marshal who doesn't have enough to proceed. No, Croft agreed, but it's also not an arrest. And with the railroad land connection documented and the reliability of Booth's account now compromised by Pruitt's statement and the timing of Booth's testimony, he's going to leave, Daniel said. Not a question. I think so, but I want to be careful about saying so. The 3 of them stood in the smithy in the mid-morning light, with the forge ticking as it cooled and the sounds of Front Street coming in through the open door, and nobody said anything for a moment. Then Eleanor said, That's enough for today. Both men looked at her. It's not everything, she said, but it's enough to work with and more than we had. We take it as it is and we keep going. She looked at Daniel. It means you're not arrested. It means Pruitt's statement is in the federal record. It means if someone tries to reopen this again for the railroad, there's a documented counter-narrative with notarized evidence attached. She paused. That's real. Whatever comes next, that's real. Daniel nodded. He looked like a man who was being careful with relief the way you're careful with something that's still fragile, holding it close but lightly. Webb left Willow Creek 4 days later, on a Tuesday morning, on the early stage. He stopped at the smithy the evening before he left, which Eleanor heard about from Daniel and which had apparently been a short conversation. Webb had told Daniel that the investigation was unresolved and might be revisited pending additional evidence. He had not apologized, because apology was not what the situation called for, and Webb was too professional to offer what wasn't called for. He had said that the record in Pratt County was useful documentation and that the testimony of Samuel Pruitt had been formally entered into the federal file. He had, as he was leaving, looked around the shop the same way he'd looked around it the first time he came in. Assessing, deliberate, the collection of a careful man. "You've built something here," he'd said again. "Yes," Daniel had said, and Webb had left. Willow Creek adjusted. That was the word for it. Not transformed, not altered dramatically, but adjusted. The way a community adjusts when a thing it had been waiting to resolve finally resolves in a direction it can work with. The specific shape of the adjustment was not uniform. There were people who had never doubted Daniel and were relieved, and people who had half-doubted him and were sheepish, and people who would have preferred a different outcome and were quiet about it. But the overall direction was clear. Webb's departure without an arrest was read by the town as a verdict of its own kind. Not formal, not official, but legible to people who understood that a federal marshal who has what he needs to make an arrest makes it, and a federal marshal who leaves without making one doesn't have what he needs. Business at the smithy recovered its normal pace within 10 days. The two local establishments that had put Eleanor's account reviews on hold sent word to Greaves that they'd like to proceed, and Greaves told Eleanor with the look of a man who had made a good investment and knew it. Theodore Alderman came into the shop on a Friday afternoon, not the aggressive Friday afternoon entrance of their earlier interaction, but something quieter and less armored. He nodded at Eleanor. He bought an order of hinges. He did not mention the settlement they'd reached, and neither did she, because some things were better allowed to become history without being narrated. What did not adjust, or adjusted more slowly, was Wilfred Hargrave. He did not come to the shop. He did not speak to Daniel or to Eleanor directly. He continued to move through Willow Creek with the maintained dignity of a man who believed his position was still defensible and was committed to defending it, even as the position's foundations were visibly changing. Eleanor watched this from a professional distance and said nothing about it publicly, because she had learned that the most effective thing she could do about Wilfred Hargrave was to continue being good at her work in a way that made his narrative about her increasingly implausible. But something happened in the third week after Webb left that she hadn't planned for, because it wasn't her plan. It was someone else's. She was at the bank on a Wednesday morning, finishing an assessment, when Greaves came in from the front office with the expression of a man who has just had a conversation he didn't expect. "Hargrave was here this morning," Greaves said, "before you arrived." Eleanor looked up. He wanted to know whether the bank would be interested in a partnership with his mercantile for the railroad supply contracts. Greaves set some papers on the desk with deliberate care. "I told him the bank's current consulting assessment capacity was at present fully committed, and that our existing business relationships were producing strong results." Eleanor looked at him. "I didn't tell him who was doing the assessments," Greaves said, with the carefully neutral expression of a man who knew exactly what he was doing and was not going to say so directly. "But I imagine he can deduce it." Eleanor sat with this for a moment. Then she picked up her pen and returned to the assessment. "Thank you, Mr. Greaves," she said. "Sound business practice," he said, and went back to the front office. Daniel asked her to dinner on a Thursday evening in November. Not at the hotel. She had eaten at the hotel every evening for 3 months, and they both knew that. He asked if she would join him at the restaurant on Marsh Street, which was Willow Creek's one establishment that had tablecloths and actual wine glasses, and which was used primarily for occasions. Eleanor understood what the invitation was. She understood what it wasn't yet, too. It was not a declaration, not a proposal, not a commitment to something specific. It was the motion of two people moving toward each other at the pace that two people with their particular histories could responsibly manage. She said yes. She wore the gray dress, which was becoming her most used garment, and she thought she would need to add something to her wardrobe if occasions continued to occur. The restaurant was warm, and they sat at a corner table, and the conversation moved the way it had learned to move between them over 3 months, not performing ease, not filling silence with noise, but finding the things worth saying and saying them. He told her about Kansas in a way he hadn't before, not the legal facts of it, not the documented record, but the personal texture. About the wife he'd lost in the winter of '73, fever in a bad season. About the daughter who had died before she was a year old. About how losing them had made him reckless in the way that grief makes people reckless, vocal about Calder and the water rates in a way that was righteous but not careful, and how he'd paid for the carelessness. She listened without interrupting. He asked about Margaret, her sister. about Philadelphia, about the sewing table she'd sold to buy the stagecoach fare and whether she missed it. "It was my mother's," Eleanor said. "I miss what it was, not what it is, which is money that got me here." She turned her wine glass in her hands. "I've thought about that trade. I think I made the right one. Even given how it started?" She looked at him across the table. "I'm sitting in a restaurant in Wyoming in November, having dinner with someone I respect, after 3 months of doing work that matters and getting paid for it and being, reasonably, accepted in this town." She set the glass down. "Yes, even given how it started." He was quiet for a moment, then, "I'd like to keep building this business with you." It was careful phrasing, she noted, deliberate, not asking for more than it said, but not pretending it meant less than it did. "I'd like that too," she said. The restaurant moved around them. Other diners, the soft noise of a Thursday evening, the town of Willow Creek doing what it did. Neither of them said anything more about it for the rest of the evening, because the thing had been said and saying more would have been redundant, and they were both people who understood the value of stopping when you'd said enough. Eleanor walked back to the hotel under a clear November sky, the cold sharp in her lungs, the lights of Front Street going one by one from gold to dark as the evening settled in. She thought about what came next, not with anxiety, with the particular quality of attention that belongs to someone who has gotten through the difficult middle of something and can now begin to see the shape of what comes after. The shape was not complete. It had missing sections, uncertainties, the usual unresolved edges of any real situation. But it was there, and it was hers. And 3 months ago, standing in the dust of this street with $17 and Wilfred Hargrave's voice still in the air, she would not have been certain that it would be. She was not a woman given to counting her progress too early. But tonight, walking alone under the Wyoming sky, she allowed herself a moment of noting where she stood, which was in Willow Creek, which was on solid ground, which was somewhere that had not been waiting for her when she arrived, but that she had, with patient and deliberate work, begun to make her own. Winter came to Willow Creek the way it always did in Wyoming. Not gradually, not with warning, but as a decision the land made overnight. Eleanor woke one morning in late November to find frost on the inside of the hotel window and the street below transformed into something spare and white and final looking, and she lay in bed for a few minutes longer than usual, not from reluctance but from the particular stillness that cold mornings produce in people who have survived enough of them to know that stillness before work is not laziness but preparation. She had been in Willow Creek for 5 months. The arithmetic of it still occasionally surprised her. 5 months ago, she had stood in that street with a trunk at her feet and a man's public contempt still hanging in the air, and now she had a regular chair at a bank assessment table and 2 private clients besides Daniel, and Mrs. Granger had started saving her the corner table at breakfast without being asked, and Percy had taken to calling her Miss Eleanor with the proprietary affection of a boy who has decided an adult belongs to his personal inventory of trustworthy people. She got up, dressed, and went to work. The smithy in winter had a different quality than in the warmer months. The forge was more necessary, more central, and Daniel kept it burning longer into the evening so that the shop held heat at the end of the day in a way it hadn't in September or October. Eleanor had acquired a second lamp for the back office and a better coat, both practical decisions she'd made without ceremony, the way she made most decisions. The business had grown in ways that were visible and ways that were not. The visible ways: 2 new long-term supply contracts, one with the grain storage operation and one with a ranch south of town that had decided Daniel's work was worth the distance. A steady stream of smaller jobs that came from the simple fact of reputation compounding. People who had heard from people who had heard from people that Ryder's work was reliable and his pricing was honest, and who came in having already decided to spend money before they saw the first piece of iron. Eleanor tracked all of it in ledgers that were now so organized and current that Greaves had twice asked if he could show them to other clients as an example of what good record-keeping looked like, which she'd declined on principle, but which told her something about how far they'd come from the disaster of the back office she'd first encountered in September. The less visible growth was harder to quantify, but no less real. It was the growth of 2 people who had started as employer and employee and become something that didn't have a clean professional name, partners in the true sense, each bringing something the other didn't have, each having earned the other's trust in the specific way that trust between capable people gets earned, which is through difficulty and time and the accumulation of moments where they could have failed each other and didn't. Eleanor was not a romantic about this. She was aware that the restaurant dinner in November and the conversation about what they were building together had not been followed by a formal declaration of any kind, and she was at peace with that, not because she was indifferent to what it might become, but because she understood that some things need to be constructed properly before they can hold weight, and neither of them was in the habit of building things that wouldn't hold. What she was less at peace with moving into December was Wilfred Hargrave. He had been quiet since Webb left, not absent. He was still there, still operating his mercantile, still present at civic gatherings, with the maintained dignity she'd observed in him since the beginning, but quiet in a way that had the texture of strategy rather than retreat, and Eleanor had learned enough about how Hargrave moved to know that his quietness was not the same as resolution. The thing that broke the quiet was not dramatic. It was a letter. Croft brought it to her on a Wednesday morning in December, having received it from a contact of his in the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne. The letter was a formal objection filed with the Land Office, disputing the boundary survey of a parcel on the east edge of Willow Creek, a parcel that Daniel had been discussing with the grain storage operation as a potential site for a second forge, an expansion that Eleanor had been working on the financial case for over the past 6 weeks. The objection named Wilfred Hargrave as the filing party. The grounds were a claimed prior interest in the parcel dating to 1879, a claim that had never been raised in the 3 years since, had not appeared in any public record that Eleanor or Croft could find, and that had materialized with suspicious timing exactly 4 weeks after it became clear that Daniel's expansion plans were moving from discussion toward action. Eleanor read the letter twice. Then she set it on the workbench in the smithy and let Daniel read it, and she watched his face while he did. He set the letter down. "He didn't come at us when Webb was here," Daniel said. He waited. He waited until the investigation cleared and the town had settled and it looked like we were on solid ground, Eleanor said. Then he found the next pressure point, the parcel. The parcel. She sat down. "It's not a legitimate claim. If it were legitimate, it would have appeared in the records we reviewed when you first looked at the site. Croft thinks it was filed against a survey from 1879 that had a minor notation error, a 3-foot discrepancy in the northeast boundary, and that someone went looking for a way to use that error as the foundation of a prior interest claim." "Someone," Daniel said. "Someone," she agreed. He looked at the letter again. He had the expression of a man who was tired, not demoralized, not beaten, but genuinely tired, in the way that you get tired when a thing you thought was done turns out not to be done, when the ground you thought had finally steadied shifts again under your feet. "How long does an objection like this delay things?" he asked. 6 months? Maybe 8, if it goes through the standard review process. Eleanor looked at him. "Or we can contest it." "On what grounds?" "On the grounds that the prior interest claim is based on a survey error that's been documented and can be corrected, that no transaction record exists showing Hargrave ever purchased or contracted for rights to that parcel, and that the timing of the filing is so conspicuously correlated with our expansion announcement that a territorial land officer with functioning judgment will recognize what it is." She paused. "Croft can file the contest. He's already looked at the documentation." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "He's not going to stop." "No," Eleanor said. "He's probably not. So we contest this one and then there's another one. Maybe. Or maybe we contest this one and it's expensive enough for him, in money and in the visible exposure of what he's doing, that the calculus changes." She folded her hands on the desk. "Daniel, every time he comes at us, we respond, and every response leaves a record. Every filed contest, every documented objection to his objections, every time Croft puts something on paper that shows the pattern. That's a record that accumulates. Right now, he looks like a man protecting a business interest. A few more maneuvers that look like this one, and he starts looking like what he is." Daniel looked at her. "What is he?" She thought about how to say it honestly. "A man who made a bad decision on a stagecoach platform 5 months ago and has been trying to make the world arrange itself so that decision looks less bad ever since. That's who he is." She picked up her pen. "We keep working. We contest the parcel. We document everything. And we let him be who he is until enough people see it clearly enough that he has to stop." It wasn't a satisfying answer. She knew it wasn't, and she could see Daniel knew it wasn't. He wanted a version where the problem was solved cleanly, where one decisive action ended Wilfred Hargrave's campaign and they could simply build without looking over their shoulder. She would have wanted that too, in a different story. But in the actual story, which was this one, the answer was what it was: patience and documentation and the slow accumulation of a visible record. She went back to work. After a moment, so did he. Croft filed the contest in January, and the Territorial Land Office sent a reviewer in February, which was faster than Eleanor had anticipated, and which she attributed to the thoroughness of Croft's documentation rather than the efficiency of territorial bureaucracy, which was not a thing anyone in Wyoming placed undue faith in. The reviewer was a methodical man from Cheyenne named Holt, who spent 2 days examining survey records and property files and asking precise, narrow questions of various parties. He interviewed Croft and Daniel, and Eleanor gathered through Croft's account of it Hargrave himself, which Holt had done on his own initiative and without being asked. Eleanor was not interviewed. She was aware that this was either because Holt did not consider her relevant or because he had decided her documentation spoke for itself, and she chose to interpret it as the latter. Holt's determination came back in writing 3 weeks later. The prior interest claim was found to be without basis in the recorded transaction history of the parcel. The survey error was a clerical notation that did not affect the actual boundary as physically staked. The objection was dismissed. Daniel read the determination at the workbench on a Tuesday afternoon in March, with spring making its first tentative appearance outside the shop door and Eleanor sitting across from him with her coffee getting cold. "That's it?" he said. "That's it for the parcel." She watched him. "That's not necessarily it for Hargrave." "No." He set the document down. "But it's something." "It's something," she agreed. What happened next, Eleanor had not predicted, and she would think about it later as an example of the way life occasionally surprises you. Not with catastrophe, but with something that works out better than you had any rational basis to expect. Wilfred Hargrave came to the smithy. He came on a Thursday afternoon in late March, unannounced, the way he had always entered places he believed were his to enter on his own schedule. But the quality of his entrance was different this time. He didn't look around the office with the assessing superiority he'd deployed in September. He stood in the doorway, hat in hand, literally in his hand, not on his head, and he looked at Eleanor and Daniel with an expression that she recognized after a moment as the expression of a man who has run out of directions to move and has arrived, through exhaustion or through something harder to name, at the only direction left. "I'd like to speak with both of you," he said. Daniel looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at Daniel. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "All right," Daniel said. Hargrave came in and sat on the stool that was too small for anyone but which was the available seating, and he sat on it without appearing to notice its inadequacy, which was its own kind of signal. "I'm going to say something, and I'm going to ask you to let me finish it," he said. "Go ahead," Eleanor said. He looked at his hat, which he was turning in his hands in the same way Daniel turned objects when he was thinking something difficult. "I have been, he stopped. "I've been in business in this town for 11 years. I built the mercantile from a dry goods wagon. I know what it costs to build something here. I know what it costs to protect it." He paused. "I've told myself that what I was doing was protecting what I'd built, that the way things work in this territory requires a certain dominance, that if someone comes in and operates without the standing I've established, it undermines that standing." Eleanor watched him. She kept her face still. "That was wrong," Hargrave said. It came out flatly, which paradoxically made it more credible than if he'd delivered it with feeling. "The parcel thing, the bank thing, the things I said to the Merchants Association." He looked at Daniel. "And what I said to you in the street in September, when you arrived." He was not quite able to look at Eleanor when he said the last part. "Look at me when you say it," Eleanor said, not harshly, just as a statement of what was required. He looked at her. He was not a man accustomed to being told where to direct his eyes, and it cost him something to do it. "What I said to you in the street was cruel, and it was wrong. And it was the kind of thing that a man says when he has decided, before any evidence exists, that the situation is going to be inconvenient for him and that the person in front of him is responsible for his inconvenience." He held her gaze. "You deserve none of it." The office was very quiet. Eleanor thought about September, about the dust of the street and the watching crowd and the specific quality of Wilfred Hargrave's voice when he'd said the word cursed, the way it had moved through the assembled town and done its work before she'd even had time to fully understand what was happening. She thought about $17 and a broken plan and the particular loneliness of a place that has decided what you are before you've spoken. She thought about what she wanted from this moment. What she wanted was not vengeance, and was not the clean, complete satisfaction of being vindicated by the man who had wronged her, because she had learned enough by now to know that vindication from the person who hurt you is never as complete as you imagine it will be, and that the more durable satisfaction comes from what you build in the time after the hurt, not from the acknowledgement of the person who caused it. But she also understood that acknowledgement mattered, not for her, or not only for her, for the record, for the town that had watched that moment in September and had filed it away in the accumulated accounting of what people were and what they did. "Thank you," she said. She meant it without excess. Just those two words, delivered as what they were, a receipt. An acknowledgement that she'd heard what he said and registered it as the thing it was. Hargrave nodded. He turned to Daniel. "The parcel contest cost me more than the money. I knew it would, and I filed it anyway. That was, I don't have a better word for it than petty." He paused. "I'm not going to interfere with your expansion, and I'd like to propose—" He stopped. "This is going to sound like something it isn't, but I'm going to say it anyway. The railroad supply contracts. There's enough of them for 2 operations in this town, mine and yours. I've been operating as though there weren't, because if you succeeded at something I wanted, it felt like losing. That's poor reasoning." He looked at Daniel. "I'd rather have a town with 2 good businesses than a monopoly that requires me to spend my time undermining people." Daniel looked at him for a long moment. Eleanor had learned to read the quality of Daniel's silences, and this one was not the silence of a man suppressing anger. It was the silence of a man genuinely considering whether what he was hearing was what it appeared to be. "I'm not interested in a partnership," Daniel said finally. "Not yet, and maybe not ever. But if you stay out of our business, we'll stay out of yours. And if the railroad work comes up in a way that benefits both operations, we can talk about it then." Hargrave nodded. It was what he'd probably expected and possibly what he deserved. He left with his hat back on his head, and Eleanor watched him go through the shop window, moving up Front Street toward his mercantile with the walk of a man who had done a difficult thing and was now living in the strange territory on the other side of it. "Do you believe him?" Daniel asked. Eleanor thought about it honestly. "I believe he means it right now. Whether he means it permanently depends on things I can't predict." She turned back to the desk. "But he said it in front of both of us, and that's a record too." Spring came properly in April, the way Wyoming spring eventually arrives, tentatively at first, then all at once, like someone who has been standing outside a door deciding and then just opens it. The street dried out, the days stretched. The sound of the town changed from the muffled interior quality of winter to something more open and various and alive. Eleanor moved out of the hotel. It was a practical decision, framed practically. The hotel was not inexpensive for what it provided, and there was a set of rooms above the surveyor's office on Marsh Street that had come available in March, with decent light in the morning and a room large enough to use as a workspace, and the rent was less than the hotel for more space. She took it without particular ceremony, carried her trunk up the stairs herself with Daniel's help, and wrote to Margaret about it in the letter she'd been composing in her head for weeks. The letter that finally told the full story, from the stagecoach to the present, leaving nothing out. She wrote it the first evening in the new room, sitting at the table by the window with the spring night outside and the lamp making the space feel smaller and warmer than it was. "I want to tell you what actually happened," she wrote. "All of it. Because I think I've been protecting you from it, and that was its own kind of dishonesty, and I owe you better than that." She wrote for 2 hours. She told Margaret about the street and Hargrave and the $17, and Daniel and the forge, and the ledgers, and Kansas, and Pruitt, and the restaurant in November, and the parcel contest, and Hargrave's appearance in the shop in March. She told it the way she would have told it in person, without smoothing the parts that were hard to say, without tidying the parts that didn't have clean shapes. At the end she wrote, "I don't know exactly what I'm building here, but I know I'm building it, which is more than I knew 5 months ago when I got off that stagecoach. That's not nothing. In fact, I think it might be everything." She sent the letter on a Monday, and Margaret's response came 3 weeks later and was 5 pages long and included a pressed flower from their mother's garden, which Eleanor put between the pages of the ledger on her desk, because she needed to put it somewhere important. The expansion of the smithy broke ground in May. The parcel cleared without further obstruction. The permits came through the territorial office with what Croft described as unusual efficiency, which Eleanor attributed to the documented record they'd built over the winter, since bureaucracies move faster on straightforward cases. Daniel hired 2 additional men, a young ironworker named Abe, who had come up from Colorado, and a local boy named Martin, who had been apprenticing informally and needed formalizing. Eleanor adjusted the payroll, expanded the accounts, and spent one Saturday afternoon drawing a revised pricing schedule on a large sheet of paper which she tacked to the office wall and which caused Daniel to stand in the doorway and look at it for a long time. "You've been thinking about this for a while," he said. "Since February," she said. "I wanted to see how the Hargrave situation resolved before I committed it to paper." "That's careful. I'm a careful person." He looked at the pricing schedule another moment. "The rate for custom architectural ironwork. You've doubled it." "I've set it at what the work is worth," she said. "The current rate is half what it should be, and you know it. People will push back." "Some people will push back," she said. "The ones who do are the ones who don't value the work, and those aren't the clients we want to build the second forge around." She turned back to the ledger. "The ones who understand ironwork will pay it without argument because they know what good custom work costs and they've been getting it below value for years." He was quiet for a moment. "My father would have undersold himself forever." "Most people do," Eleanor said. "It's not a virtue." She heard him laugh, an actual laugh, not the almost laugh she'd been cataloging for months, but the real thing, easy and unguarded, the laugh of a man who has stopped being careful about whether he's allowed to find things funny. She kept her eyes on the ledger, but she was smiling. The wedding was in June, which was not a season Eleanor would have chosen. Wyoming June was unpredictable, and the week before it rained every day. But Daniel pointed out that waiting for the perfect weather in Wyoming was a strategy that could postpone things indefinitely, which she acknowledged was correct. It was a small ceremony by the choice of both of them. Croft stood up for Daniel. Mrs. Granger stood up for Eleanor, which felt right in a way that Eleanor hadn't anticipated until it happened. The older woman's presence carrying something of the witness of the last 9 months. The accumulated knowledge of what it had looked like from the beginning, when Eleanor was a stranger in a hotel room with a plan that had failed and nothing yet in its place. Percy came and stood against the back wall with the solemn expression of a boy who has decided this is an important occasion and intends to behave accordingly. He was wearing a coat that was slightly too large for him and holding his hat in his hands with the same gesture Daniel often used, which Eleanor noticed and found unexpectedly moving. Wilfred Hargrave was not there. Eleanor had not expected him to be, and had not wanted him there, and his absence was a clean and simple thing that she appreciated. What she had not expected was the number of people who did come, not invited, simply present, gathered at the edges of the gathering in the way of a town that has been watching a story develop and has arrived, in its imperfect collective way, at the conclusion that this is a story it would like to be present for. The woman from the dry goods store, the telegrapher, 2 of the ranchers who were now regular clients, Harold from the feed store, who had never spoken directly to Eleanor but who nodded at her now, with the nod of a man who means something by it. Eleanor stood in the middle of all of it and thought about September, and about how a place that had watched her be diminished in public was now watching her stand in it on her own terms, and how those 2 things existed in the same geography, in the same set of streets, among some of the same people, and how that was not a contradiction but was simply the truth of how places work. They are not good or bad in themselves, only capable of being moved, slowly, by the people who stay in them and insist on something better. She was not sentimental about it. She knew the same town that stood at the edges of this gathering had also stood at the edges of a different gathering 9 months ago and watched Wilfred Hargrave say the word cursed without moving to stop him. She was not going to pretend that hadn't happened in order to feel better about today. Both things were true, and she was large enough to hold both. Daniel said his vows, looking at her with the steady directness he brought to everything that mattered to him, and she said hers looking back, and there was nothing performed in either of them. Afterward, Mrs. Granger cried a little and denied it vigorously, and Percy shook Daniel's hand with great seriousness, and Croft made a toast that was brief and accurate and therefore better than most toasts, And Eleanor ate more of the food than she'd expected to because it turned out that a day that had cost significant emotional expenditure required corresponding caloric recovery, which she filed as a practical discovery. She wrote to Margaret again that evening from the rooms on Marsh Street, which were now both of their rooms, but which looked, she noted, exactly as they had before, except for Daniel's coat on the hook by the door and his books on the second shelf, and a lamp he'd brought from the smithy that was significantly better for reading than her original one. "I've been thinking," she wrote, "about what I would have done if the stagecoach had been going the other direction, if I'd gotten off and gone back. I think about it not with regret, but with something more like awe, I suppose, at how thin the thread is between the life you live and the life you don't. I stayed because I had nowhere to go and $17. That was the whole reason. Not courage, not conviction, just the arithmetic of my situation and the fact that a man I didn't know picked up my trunk. And now I'm here, and this is my life, and I have no way to explain to you how large and ordinary and real it is. I think that's the part nobody tells you, that the life you end up with doesn't arrive wrapped in anything. It accumulates, in days and in work and in small decisions you make when you don't feel capable of making them. And then one day you look up, and there it is." She put down her pen and looked at what she'd written. Then she looked at the lamp Daniel had brought from the smithy, which was casting good steady light across the desk. She did not have a clean lesson to offer about what the last 9 months had been, because she didn't believe that lives reduced cleanly to lessons. What she believed, looking at the light and the letter and the coat on the hook by the door, was something more like this: that the door Wilfred Hargrave had closed on her in September had been a real door closing, with real weight and real consequence, and that she had not walked through some better door that had been waiting on the other side. She had built the other door. With her hands and her mind and her ledgers and her willingness to stay when staying was hard. That was the thing. Not that things worked out, which they had, imperfectly and over time, but that working out required the work, the actual unglamorous daily work of a person refusing to become the story someone else tried to tell about them. She was 32 years old. She had a business and a husband and a town that was beginning, slowly, to know what she was worth, which was more than it had known when she arrived. She was not cursed. She never had been. She folded the letter and addressed it and set it by the door for morning, and then she turned off the lamp. Not her lamp, both their lamp now, and the room went dark. And outside, the Wyoming summer night was doing what summer nights do, which is exist in the specific way of something neither permanent nor passing, just fully, completely present in the time that it has. Eleanor McKenna. Ryder lay in the dark and listened to the town breathing around her, and she was not waiting for anything. She had already arrived.